Fill me out with your smile. Now the sunshine brings the light. Fill me out with a flame. I will let you in this game. Take me out when I'm down. 'Cause with you I'm safe and sound. 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 I'm safe and
creating your first video? You should start with the music. Go to artlist.io and get high-quality music and sound effects for any type of video you want to create. For example, let's make it intense. Feeling sexy? Now, epic. Just maybe close the door before you start shooting. Get unlimited downloads, a license that fits all your creative needs, and perfect for every platform. Go to Artlist now and start creating without limits.
To help protect from HIV, I prep without pills.
With Apretude, a prescription medicine used to reduce the risk of HIV without daily PrEP pills, with one shot every other month, just 6 times a year. In studies, Apretude was proven superior to a daily PrEP pill in reducing the risk of HIV. You must be HIV negative to receive Apretude and get tested before each injection. If you think you were exposed to HIV or have flu-like symptoms, tell your doctor right away. Apretude does not prevent other sexually transmitted infections. Practice safer sex to reduce your risk. Don't take Apretude if you are allergic to it or taking certain medicines as they may interact. Tell your doctor if you've had liver problems or mental health concerns. If you have a rash or other allergic reactions, stop Apretude and get medical help right away. Serious side effects include allergic reactions, liver problems, and depression. Some of the most common side effects include injection site reactions and headache. You must receive Apretude as scheduled. Ask your doctor about long-acting Apretude. Save at apretude.com.
All right, here we go. Wait, give me 1 second. All right. How's it going? All right, there we go. So we are going to watch this week's Bible passage. We're going to watch a sermon on it. And then play a game of Risk while we do that. And then go through some news that's going on today. Hopefully we get into that. Maybe react to some other content. Let's get into it right now. This week's Bible passage is Leviticus 25, 1 through 7. It's about the It's about the Sabbath year.
Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, they keep failing us. And John Tester was given a choice. Time after.
Okay, so you guys are going to want to open your Bibles to Leviticus, because that's where we're going to be tonight. Leviticus is one of the books of the Bible that we often don't know what to do with. I mean, it was easy to apply it if you were a priest working in the tabernacle in Old Testament times. But as a Christian today, a follower of Jesus Christ today, it's like, what am I supposed to do with this? By way of introduction or reminder, this is part of the Jesus in the Old Testament series, which has been an extensive series, building a case of how to see types of Christ in the Old Testament.
Sometimes I think I get kicked out because I'm a master.
The theology behind looking for types, examples of types. And right now what we're doing is I thought, let me go to a book of the Bible that has a great amount of typology in it, Leviticus, but it's a book that a lot of people just, they find unrewarding, I think. And one thing that might help you find it more rewarding is by seeing the typology in the book. So we're going to cover the first 7 chapters today, and we're going to be looking specifically at the sacrifices that happen in the book of Leviticus. I'll give you some more details, but just a reminder. I know you're hovering in Leviticus chapter 1, and that's where you should be, but Galatians 3:24 says this. It says, "The law was our guardian until Christ came in order that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian." And so we're not under the law in the same sense that the Jewish people were under the law when it was given. It was given for a time, and then it is no longer binding upon us. Okay, it was never really binding upon all people anyways. It was only to Israel. But even though I'm grafted in, I'm not bound under the law. So that would be a biblical concept. So when the Old Testament priest, the Levitical priest, would open the book of Leviticus, he would actually see instructions for his job. It was like his job manual. Here's what you do. Here's when you do it. Here's how you do it. The application, though, to a Christian is going to be all about the foreshadowing. Or at least, not all, but largely it's going to be about the foreshadowing. How did this represent Christ? How did this picture Christ? How is this the guardian that brought me to Christ to show me faith? So I think the first thing I'll mention right off the bat is, since we're going to cover Leviticus 1 through 7, these are the sacrifice. It's going to talk about 5 different kinds of sacrifices. And the most obvious piece of typology that we really shouldn't take for granted is that Jesus is the sacrifice. Now, I want you to imagine the impact of Leviticus and of the teaching here about sacrifices. Just imagine if it wasn't there at all. Imagine if Jesus shows up and there was no Old Testament law and there was no Levitical priesthood. And then John the Baptist sees Jesus and he turns and he says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." And the Jews are like, "The what of what? The what of God? Who does what?" See, that doesn't make any sense apart from the Levitical law. The very nature of Christ's sacrifice is taught to people through the template of the sacrifices in Leviticus. And we take for granted how much detail there is here relating to Jesus. So the most obvious thing is just that. Jesus is the sacrifice. He is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of not the people of Israel, not just this one guy with a sacrifice, but of the world. There's a worldwide atonement that's taking place. So ideas like atonement, ideas like sacrifice, ideas like substitution.
All right, I gotta go up the stairs real fast. I'll be right back.
You know, this animal instead of me, you know, the clean for the unclean. That all this stuff comes from Leviticus. The life is in the blood, and the blood is for atonement, and the sprinkling, and it's all in Leviticus. So the rough outline of Leviticus is, if you just looked at the whole book, is like, here's stuff that happened at the tabernacle. That's like the basic topic of the book of Leviticus. It has other concepts in there as well, but that's the basic idea. And the first 7 chapters detail 5 specific sacrifices. And you can see them in order, and then at the end of chapter 7 it summarizes. So flip ahead to chapter 7. Let's look at the summary at the end of the section. Leviticus 7:37. After explaining all the sacrifices, it then summarizes. And it says, 7:37, "This is the law of the burnt offering," that's one kind of offering, "the grain offering, the sin offering, the guilt offering, of the ordination offering, and of the peace offering." Now, the ordination offering is only offered for the priests when they become ordained. So it's not a normal offering that happens regularly. So 5 of those are the regular ones: the burnt, the grain, the sin, the guilt, and the peace offering. We're going to go through those offerings today and how they have typological significance for Christians. So pretty interesting stuff. Let's start in Leviticus chapter 1, and it begins the book giving us this intro. It says, "The Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, 'Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when any one of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of livestock from the herd or from the flock. And then it gets into all these different kinds of offerings and how they are to be done. What it's going to do is it's going to name a type of offering. In this case, it'll start with the burnt offering in chapter 1. Then it's going to give what items or things could be offered under the category burnt offering. Then it will get into maybe when it would be offered, on what occasion this would happen, or why. And then it will also get into the procedure. So once you bring your sheep or your bull or whatever, here's what the priest is going to do. He's going to, basically the priests were like butchers. I mean, they're like, not butchers like in the pejorative sense, but like butchers like in the career sense. Like they're chopping up animals and they're separating them into the usable and unusable parts and things like that. They're doing this, and the instructions are all in Leviticus. So let's talk about the birth. There's no birth offering. That's awkward. Burnt offering. Let's talk about the burnt offering in Leviticus chapter 1, starting in verse 3. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer a male without blemish. He shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting. That would be the tabernacle, right? That he may be accepted before the Lord. He shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him. So the type of offering in chapter 1, and it's through the whole chapter, is the burnt offering. The entire chapter is about just the burnt offering. It had to be a specific kind of creature. It had to be male, couldn't be female. It had to be without blemish. It could be a bull, it could be a sheep or a goat, or if they were poor, they could even bring birds. But only if they were poor, if you keep reading through the chapter. It had to have no blemish, no defects, and the idea here is that it's a substitution. You see, the offerer is blemished. The offerer is defective, right? But the animal is not. It's unblemished. It's without defect. Immediately we're getting this idea of the perfect going out and being offered for the sake of the imperfect. And we have this substitutionary concept that's being taught here. 1 Peter 3:18 says this, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit." So Jesus, he's the righteous suffering for the unrighteous, but this has its roots in Leviticus, how the male without blemish is offered for those who do have blemishes, so to speak. It's symbolic. I mean, it's not like the lamb that doesn't have any weird hair growths on it is really sinless. It's just without blemish. It's just something that is representative. That's the idea. It actually gives new meaning to Ephesians 5:27. In fact, a lot of your New Testament has deeper meaning once you understand Leviticus. And I'll fully admit, Leviticus is not fun to read. I fully admit it. But I also don't think the Bible was written for your entertainment. It was written for your good, but not for your entertainment. And if you've noticed this,
What's my based opinion? I have a lot of them. You'd have to ask me what my based opinion on a certain topic is.
books in your life that
But follow Christ. Christ is king. That's the main one.
are the best for you are not the ones that are the most entertaining. And the ones that are the most entertaining
Christ
are
is
not
the one
exactly
true
best for
God.
you. It's just the way of reality. Leviticus, its instructions to the Levitical
People? What do you mean, people? What's my based opinion on people? I love everybody, man.
priests, but it foreshadows Christ, and it makes many statements of the New Testament make a lot more sense. So Ephesians 5:27, speaking of Jesus and what he did for us, it says, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. And here we have Ephesians saying, hey, the without spot and wrinkle, that's representative of being holy and without blemish. So the offering of the burnt offering was without spot or wrinkle, without any problems. It's representative of being offered holy and without blemish. It has to be a free will offering in Leviticus chapter 1. The burnt offering could not be forced upon you. It had to be something you chose to bring. The priests weren't going to come and take it from you. Now that were you supposed to offer it? Yeah. There were times you were supposed to do it, but it had to be willfully offered. I choose to give this to God. That's the idea. In John 10:17, I think this connects to Jesus, because he says, for this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This charge I've received from my Father. So Jesus has offered by free will. Now, I think the burnt offering has like a double typology in it, because the burnt offering is offered completely. There's nothing left over from it. It was all consumed. And the idea in that sense is it's something that's wholly devoted to God. It just belongs entirely to God. Now, Christ's entire life was wholly devoted and entirely belonged to God. But then we get in Romans 12, verse 1, we get this idea that we are called to offer ourselves to God now, a living sacrifice. Jesus died and rose again that we might be then a living sacrifice. In a sense, a burnt offering is like a person who's sold out for Christ. I'm living for Jesus Christ. My entire life belongs to Jesus. And I think the church needs to hear this, because so often it's like, I feel like I've got my religion in its right place in my life. Wait a minute, right place? Whatever place in my life that doesn't belong to Jesus is a place in my life that doesn't belong in my life.
Exactly.
I'm wholly belonging to the Lord. I'm fully His. So the free will aspect is there. The location is specified in Leviticus 1. It says that this offering had to happen in a specific place. It has to happen there at the door of the tabernacle. By that, it didn't mean the door of the actual structure where the tent was, but rather there was that wall, that tent, the cloth wall that went all the way around. Well, that had one doorway, and you had to bring the offering through that door. In the original tabernacle, there was only one door, and it had to come through there. And Jesus, of course, he says that he is the door. He says that he is the way, and no one comes to the Father except through him. All these offerings have to come through the tabernacle. We already did a whole teaching on how the tabernacle represents Christ, and there's so much stuff there. It gives the reason. It says to make atonement. To make atonement, and the idea of atonement here is, well, that's like a whole other Bible study, the Old Testament concept of atonement and all that, which I'm not teaching today. But that's the purpose of this offering, although it does seem like it's not, specific sins aren't generally the thing that triggers the burnt offering. It's rather the idea of being connected to God, being offering yourself to the Lord is kind of the concept. That'll make more sense as I talk about the other offerings. One thing you'll notice about these offerings is something that you may have assumed, is that the priest is the one who's going to kill. You bring the animal and the priest kills it. But in every case, with all of the offerings, what we see in verse 5, the person who kills or slays the offering is the person who's offering it. The priest is the one who handles it afterwards, right? Handles the blood and chops it up and does all the proper things with it. But it says in verse 5, he shall kill the bull. It's going to be the offerer that has to do the killing. I think that's really interesting. And part of the reason is because it's for his sin. He's bringing it for his sin. He's offering it, so he's the one who slays it. Now, for many years, people have been debating who killed Jesus. Have you heard these debates? Who killed Jesus? And some people have attacked Jewish people by saying, oh, the Jews were Christ killers. And then others actually read the Bible.
Were they not?
And they went, well, actually, he died at the hand of Romans. So it's the Romans. The Romans are the Christ killers.
Because the Jews said to.
And then you read the Bible more carefully and you're like, well, gosh, you've got Judas, his own disciple.
But people killed Jesus.
Betrays
Basically.
him. You've got the other disciples, they flee. Then you have the Jewish hands that take him and they parade him around and they abuse him and they deliver him to the Romans. So then you got the Roman hands that take him and they're the ones that actually end up crucifying him. So who killed Jesus? Yes. The Jews, the Romans, one of his own disciples betraying him. Yes, they killed Jesus. Humanity killed Jesus. The Gentile and the Jew and the non-Jew, they all worked together to kill Jesus. But here's the thing. In the Levitical system, the one who killed the offering, well, guess what? The offering was for that person. And I think while they had not intended it that way, that's how God intended it. I think God wanted for Jewish and Roman hands, for Jew and Gentile hands, to both be involved in the killing of the offering, the ultimate offering, the Lamb of God, because he was taking away their sin. In connection with the killing, in Leviticus 1:4, we read this, that he's going to lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him. So he lays his hand upon the head of it, and this happens a few times in the book of Leviticus, the laying on of hands. Later on, there's rabbinic writings that describe this, and they describe it as, this is just tradition, but you wouldn't just touch the animal, you lean on the animal, like putting your weight on the animal. So the idea is it's like a sense of transference that's going on there, or identification. What's interesting too, though, is that in Matthew 26, verse 50, it says, when Jesus was betrayed by Judas, Jesus said to him, friend, do what you came to do. Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And so I think about the ones who were involved in his death, also the ones who all had laid hands on him, really, as he was being the offering for mankind's sins. So he was the offering for the world, I think is the picture there. Also in Leviticus 1:5, it says, Aaron's sons, the priests, shall bring the blood and throw the blood against the sides of the altar that is at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So that's going to be the bronze altar where the actual the roasting is going to take place. So there's an altar there. There's an altar inside. That's the altar of incense. Then there's the actual final altar in the Holy of Holies. Those aren't involved yet. This is just an external. The burnt offering is an external event. It happens outside of the tabernacle or in the courtyard area. The burnt offering, again, was given completely. In verse 13, we read that it was a pleasant aroma, a pleasing aroma. Some people paint an ugly picture of the temple, and they imagine that like the tabernacle was just soaking in blood all the time. There's blood everywhere. And I've even heard pastors speak very crudely about it, like, it was a bloody religion, blood. But when you read the actual details, it was all very controlled. The blood was used only in specific areas, and then it was just poured out in special locations. Even when they brought it in, they would just, dip their finger and like sprinkle it. They would just sprinkle it or touch it to the horns of the altar, and there it would just have like a representative amount of it there. But generally speaking, there's going to be a pleasant aroma actually around this place because they're constantly cooking. That's the idea. The meat goes on the fire, and you're smelling the smell of barbecue, so to speak. So you can actually go pretty deep into symbolism here if you want. I am going to try to stay somewhat conservative and not go too far overboard, in my opinion. But you can go deeper into symbolism. For instance, I'll give you an example what is conjecture. This might be symbolic, I don't know. But if the offering was birds, then they had a special procedure for the birds, for the burnt offering. They would take the birds and they would pluck the feathers of the bird off. Then they would put the feathers on the ash pile. And the bird was burned. It was part of the burnt offering, right? Fully consumed. But the feathers were not. They just sat there on the ashes. Now, you could say that birds, they fly in the heavens, and they're like a heavenly type creature, and we have angelic beings that have wings and stuff like that. And so perhaps the plucking of the feathers is like Christ laying aside his glory. He belongs to heaven, but he comes down to be amongst us. He is fully offered to God, and yet there's the feathers, the things that allow him to fly, waiting for him there, so that after the offering, he's able to take them up again, so to speak. I mean, is that what God intended? I don't know. This is conjecture, but this is part of what we can do if we're cautious about it and thoughtful as we look at these things. If it was a bull, a goat, or a sheep, one of the procedures was that they would cleanse the actual inner organs. They would take them out and they'd wash them before they roasted them, before they put them on the fire. Now, I don't know. Maybe there's something there about Christ, how he was clean internally and externally. He was perfectly moral in motive and in actions and in all things, unlike you or me or anybody else we've ever met. Okay, so there's just some possible symbolism. I do recommend looking through and kind of thinking, hey, maybe there's something here or there. You don't have to make it up, but you can look for it and find parallels. Then we have the grain offering in chapter 2. The grain offering is also called, in the King James Version, the meat offering. But that's just because back then the word meat would be used for bread, not just,
I really hope that it doesn't trade place right there and just hit my 7. That would suck. It does too. That's what
carne,
it does.
right? Not just beef and that sort of thing. So in the King James, it'd be called the meat offering, or I think the New King James calls it the meal offering, and I think ESV here calls it the grain offering. So Leviticus 2, chapter 2, verse 1, it says, when anyone brings a grain offering as an offering to the Lord, his offering shall be of fine flour. Here's the requirements for the grain offering. Fine flour, he shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it and bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests. And he shall take from it a handful of the fine flour and oil with all of its frankincense. Notice this, all the frankincense is going to go, not just some. And the priest shall burn this as a memorial portion on the altar, a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. But the rest of the grain offering shall be for Aaron and his sons. It is a most holy part of the Lord's food offering. Meaning that
Does he smack my set? 10?
There's holy offerings and most holy offerings. The holy offering, the people could eat it. The most holy offering, only the priest could eat that, and they had to eat it inside the tabernacle location. So this is actually a technical term, most holy offering. So this could be flour finely beaten, or it could be baked loaf or wafers if you read on in the passage. You could cook it on a griddle or on a pan. The important thing is, however you made your bread, is that it was fine, good quality flour. Because again, it's the best. It's the best that's being offered, as Christ was the best. Fine flour offered with oil, salt, and frankincense. So I think if we look at the elements of the grain offering, we see elements that relate to Christ. And I think that many of you you're already ahead of me, right? You can predict what I'm going to share with you next. He was fine flour, or high quality, just like the animals, high quality. Well, Jesus, he tells them in John, don't labor for the bread which perishes, but labor for that bread which gives everlasting life, the best of the bread.
I don't get why he doesn't take this.
John 6:51, he says, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. So he's saying, hey, the bread, that's me. These are sacrificial terms in John 6:51. He's going to give his body for the life of the world. His grain offering will be himself. The burnt offering will be himself. All of the offerings will end up being Christ. The bread had to be unleavened. Unleavened. Leaven or yeast, it's that agent that causes the bread to rise and the dough to become more puffy. It makes for good bread, but symbolically, God did not want it involved in the process of the offerings and the altar. Some people say because yeast involves corruption. I mean, that's kind of what it is. It's stuff that's decaying or whatever. It's somehow releasing gases and stuff. And while it makes my bread taste good, he doesn't want it representative in this offering. Leaven can represent sin, and it can also represent pride in the scriptures. 1 Corinthians 5:6. Your boasting is no good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? And it is the pride and the arrogant attitude they had towards sin in that church that was the leaven that was affecting them, changing their attitude towards God. Jesus, he was sinless. He had no leaven, so to speak, in him. He is the sinless one. So there's the unleavened bread. But also, leaven is a representation of bread being bigger than bread really is. You take a piece of bread and you ever make bread and you prove it? And you go through one or two proving. I know, because I watch baking shows. Not because I make bread. I just watch cooking shows. But when you let it prove, it puffs up. Now, is there more bread? Not really, no. It's just puffed up. Now, that's fine for bread, but symbolically, I think it can represent pride. 1 Corinthians alludes to this when it says in 1 Corinthians 8:1, it says, knowledge puffs up, right? But love edifies. And so knowledge makes me think more of myself than I should, and that can definitely be the case. Little side note, if you ever are wondering yourself, am I being proud? The answer is always yes. That little tiny niggling thought in your head, that little, maybe I'm being proud. Yeah, you are. Absolutely. That's my rule for me. The second I think maybe this is pride, it's always pride every single time. I've never been like, no, I'm actually more humble than I thought. Like, that's never happened. So you couldn't offer leaven, but it also says you can't offer honey. And this really puzzled me for a while. Why was there no honey in the grain offering? Why is it specifically ruled out? So honey, it turns out, as I study things I don't do, like bread, like making bread, it turns out honey, while it's not a leavening agent, it's a catalyst when you don't have leaven, and all you have is the natural leaven that's already inside of bread. It's just not enough to make it rise, though. Well, you can add honey, and the leaven feeds on the honey, and then it's a catalyst for when you have not enough leaven. So he says no leaven, no honey, probably because they have the same effect on the bread. And so there are certain recipes that actually call for this stuff. You can go Google them, and you can make some of that bread and bring it, because we can eat it. It's still good. It just doesn't fit in the offering. So Christ, he's the sinless one. He has no sin in him, and his humility. Talk about no pride. Talk about being flattened out. He comes and becomes low like one of us, Philippians chapter 2. It's also offered with oil. Now, what does oil represent in Scripture? The Holy Spirit. This is easy, right? So he's offered with oil, the Holy Spirit. Zechariah 4 talks about this, oil representing the Spirit. In fact, the term Christ, or in the Hebrew Messiah, what does it mean? Anointed one. And the high priest, he gets oil covered all over him. The concept is that he is the one who, according to Scripture, he has the Spirit without measure. That's Jesus. So he is anointed. So he's without pride and without sin and of the finest quality and filled with the Holy Spirit, the oil, plus salt. Why was salt added? Salt was on all of these offerings. The salt was very important to include. Well, salt is related to grace. In fact, in Colossians 4:6, it says, "Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person." A good reminder for us to let our words be gracious, seasoned with salt. In this case, seasoned with salt is the same as gracious. That's what he's saying. It's becoming more flavorful, more kindness. Is there a way to say that in a better way, perhaps? Also, salt is the opposite of leaven. Leaven has this decay effect. Salt has this preserving effect. It's a preservative. So there could be relation there to Christ. And then it's also offered with incense. And the incense, okay, when I brought the grain offering, I'd bring this whole grain offering, whether I baked it or it was just the flour, but I bring the same basic ingredients, however I prepared it. And only a handful of the flour and the oil, salt and all that, would just be tossed into the fire. But all of the frankincense would go. The rest of this is for the priests. They get to eat this. This is like their paycheck, so to speak. This is how they make a living. But the frankincense is all burned up because it's going to make sure that this is a wonderful smelling offering. That's the idea. It would smell good as it goes on the fire. Well, frankincense shows up at the birth of Christ. We always read about the three kings. We three kings of Orient are. Okay, we don't know how many kings there were. The reason why we use the number 3 is because we know how many gifts there were. There was gold, there was frankincense, and there was myrrh. And they all relate to Jesus in really special ways. But the frankincense is offered here. Interestingly enough, when does frankincense show up? It shows up when Jesus is where? In what town? Oh, little town of? Bethlehem. Anybody know what Bethlehem means? House of bread. He comes to the house of bread. He is to be the bread of life, and here he is offered with the frankincense, so to speak. I think that's pretty cool. Okay, then in chapter 2, verse 2, it says, "And the priest shall burn it as a memorial on the altar, an offering made by fire." See, the grain offering is the only offering here that's referred to as a memorial. That's interesting, isn't it? A memorial? Why is it like, that means bringing it to memory. It'll be a memory offering. In Luke 22:19, Jesus, in enacting the new covenant and communion that we still partake of today on a regular basis, he says this. It says, "And he took bread," Luke 22:19, "and when he'd given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, 'This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me,'" or in memorial of me. So here he is offering them the bread, saying, "Do this in memory of me." And so I think there's a foreshadowing there, the grain offering being an offering where a portion of it is as a memorial. So it is a memorial for us today still. That's the grain offering. All right, chapter 3. Now, I don't know about you, but I mean, to me, Leviticus is getting exciting. Believe it or not. Did you know that could happen? I don't know if you knew that could happen. It is to me. The peace offering, the third offering we'll look at is the peace offering. That's chapter 3. So Leviticus chapter 3, verse 1. "If his offering is a sacrifice of peace offering, if he offers an animal from the herd, male or female, he shall offer it without blemish before the Lord, and he shall lay his hand on the head of his offering," there's that laying on of hands again, "and kill it," the guy who's offering it kills it, that's consistent, "at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall throw the blood against the sides of the altar." So this blood's going to go against the sides of the altar. Now the peace offering is very similar to the burnt offering in that the blood is poured against the altar of the burnt offering, so it's poured outside the tabernacle there. It has to be brought from an animal of the herd. That's similar, so not like the grain offering. Oh, I should add, by the way, the grain offering, it was not generally offered alone.
Oh.
Oftentimes for offerings, one person would bring 2 or 3 of these different offerings at one time. And so the grain offering is usually with another offering. It's not usually by itself. But, yeah, just a side note. Except here's how the peace offering is very different than the burnt offering. The burnt offering, except for the skin of the animal, that went to the priests. The burnt offering was totally consumed. The peace offering was not totally consumed. So let's read about this in verse 14 of chapter 3. "Then he shall offer from it, as his offering for a food offering to the Lord, the fat covering the entrails and all the fat that is on the entrails, and the 2 kidneys with the fat that is on them, and the loins, and the long lobe of the liver, that he shall remove with the kidneys, and the priest shall burn them on the altar as a food offering with a pleasing aroma. All the fat is the Lord's. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwelling places, that you eat neither fat nor blood." This didn't mean they couldn't have like a steak with some fat on it, but it was the fat that was part of the innards, the offal and the inedible parts of the animal. It was like, don't eat this. They could still like make soap out of it and render it down and do other things with it, but not to eat it. Right? That was as far as consuming it. No, it was meant to be consumed by the altar as an offering to God. That was the idea. What about the rest of the meat? There's still a lot of meat after you've taken all this stuff off. Well, they eat it. And this is the first offering, eaten not just by the priest, but by the person as well. So the breast and the right thigh of the offering, they go to the priest. All the rest of the meat goes to the person bringing the offering. And they're required to eat it within a short period of time. So here's an offering where the priest partakes of it, the person offering partakes of it, and part of it is given to God. It's a peace offering, like fellowship, a fellowship offering. We're at peace, and so all parties are partaking of this thing. We're all united through an offering. That's the idea. The peace offering brought them all together. So with that in mind, realizing the peace offering is about an offering that brings us all into fellowship, Romans 5:1, it says, therefore, since we've been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. It brings us to God. We have peace with God. That's the idea of the peace offering. It's an offering of fellowship. Galatians 3, verses 27 and 28 says this. For as many
What is he doing?
of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. And just as the peace offering is bringing together the people with the priest, with the Lord, we are not only brought to God in peace, we're brought into each other's peace. I have peace with people because of Christ, who I would not even have friendship with apart from Christ. Like, would we have anything uniting us? I don't know. I'm not saying like we would hate each other necessarily, but there would just be no connection. But knowing Jesus means being part of a family. You're part of the family of God. And some of us maybe we're disconnected from that family. We think of being part of the church as just attending on Sundays, when it really means being part of the fellowship of the people. It's like more than that. It's not less than attendance. It's more than attendance. It's connection. It's family. And we need it. In Ephesians 4, it talks about this bond of peace that we have. Ephesians 4:1, it says, I therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Christian love is part of this is knowing that we have been given, Jesus is our peace offering, and he's brought us peace with each other, and our goal is to maintain that peace, to maintain that fellowship, to partake of it. There's a unique thing about the peace offering. According to Maimonides, which is a famous rabbi of the past, a highly respected Jewish rabbi, not a Christian, not following Messiah, but according to him, the peace offering is the one offering that when they would lay their hands on the offering, they would offer thanksgiving and praise, and they would not offer confession. So you would lay your hands and you would just offer a hymn of praise, a song of praise. You'd make statements of worship as you were offering the peace offering. So making it very different than the last two offerings we're going to cover, the sin and the guilt offering. Very different. So the peace offering is about fellowship. It's about worship and fellowship. And I think it connects, I'll give you one final New Testament passage I think connects to the peace offering. It's Colossians 3. Colossians 3, verse 15. I need to have a water offering real quick. All right. Colossians 3:15 says, and let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body shared by all. And be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. Now, I think he writing this knows that this is kind of what happens when they're doing the peace offering, even at the temple, as they lay hands on it and they're praising God and they're fellowshipping together. And whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. As Christians, it's very important that you realize you are not just forgiven, you have peace. Peace with God, peace with each other, and that we seek to maintain that because there is a sweetness in life when we have peace. Okay, those are the nice offerings. Then we get to the more tough ones, which is the last two offerings, the sin offering and the guilt offering. So the sin offering is in chapter 4, verse 1, all the way through halfway through chapter 5. And let's read chapter 4, verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel, saying, if anyone sins unintentionally in any of the Lord's commandments, notice that word unintentionally. about things not to be done, and does any one of them, if it is the anointed priest who sins, thus bringing guilt on the people, then he shall offer for the sin that he has committed a bull from the herd without blemish to the Lord for a sin offering. Okay, this sin offering is about sin. The burnt offering, it had the word atonement in it, but except for the very beginning of chapter 1, we haven't had a mention of sin yet. It's here in chapter 4 where sin is mentioned. Hey, if you sin, you're going to bring a sin offering. These last two offerings are about sin. They're about dealing with the sin issues. That's what they're about. They're very occasional, and there's a lot of details. It's like if a priest does the sin, he brings this kind of offering. If a ruler of the people sins, he brings this kind of offering. If a normal person sins, they bring this kind of offering. If they're really poor, they can bring this other offering. In fact, generally speaking, it's animals all the way down, different animals for the sin offering. But if you're really poor, you could actually bring a grain offering instead of an animal. Except the grain offering, if it's for a sin offering, you can't put any incense on it because it's not sweet. It's not nice. It's painful. It's hurtful. That's the idea of the sin offering. It's not this pleasant thing. So the sin offering and the next one, the trespass offering, they're for sin. And the first time the word forgiveness or forgiven comes up in Leviticus is in this discussion of the sin offering. It's in Leviticus 4:20. It says, "Thus shall he do with the bull, as he did with the bull of the sin offering, so shall he do with this, and the priest shall make atonement for them, and they shall be forgiven." So it's about obtaining forgiveness. It's a mandatory offering. This is not a free will offering. This is like, you have to do this. You commit the sin, there has to be an offering for this sin. And for us, there must be an offering for our sins. Jesus says the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinners. It's not an optional thing. When Peter tells him, "Oh no, Lord, don't let it happen," he says, "Get behind me, Satan." Like, no, this has to happen. This offering must take place. There's no oil. There's no frankincense, right? These things are nice, and they are never offered. Even if a grain offering is offered because of poverty, then no oil, no frankincense, because the sin and the trespass offering have a different kind of taste to them, different kind of feel to them than that. It's a bitter thing. It's a dark thing. It's like a Garden of Gethsemane thing. It's like on the cross thing. It's not the sweetness of fellowship. It's something else. It's only for sins done in ignorance. Now, some people debate, and I'm not sure if I know the exact answers here, but I'll share it with you. Some people debate these sins done in ignorance. Does that mean, like, if you sinned and you knew that what you were doing was wrong and you did it anyways, that there was no offering for that? I don't think it's quite that clear. Because later on, it lists those sins as involving lying. Well, you don't lie without knowing it, generally speaking. And it seems to be you lied knowing it in the context that is described here. So some people instead, they say it's the difference of having a premeditated, high-handed sin versus like weakness of your flesh. You're just being a sinful human kind of sin. So, for instance, a high-handed sin. Can you think of in Scripture any examples of a high-handed sin? Someone they knew exactly what they were doing, and they just rebelled against God and did it anyway? How about David and Bathsheba? There's no sin offering for you, David. Not for what you did with Bathsheba. The trespass too. The trespass offering is not applied to those situations. Somebody commits murder on purpose, premeditated murder, no offering in the law for that. These are definitely high-handed. They're definitely not included as having offerings. So I'll come back to that in a minute, but I think that's important to know. So these are sins done in ignorance. And they're also group sins. The sin offering is the only offering that's presented for whole groups of people. On the Day of Atonement, they present a sin offering. It's for groups of people. I think the sin offering connects to sin nature. It's about our sin nature. It's about our inherent sin nature. The sin offering was offered for all the people, but the guilt or trespass offering, the last one we're going to cover next, it was never offered for all the people. It was only offered for individuals. We read about our sin nature in Romans 3, in Romans 7, right? I don't do what I want to do. Why am I doing sinful, wicked things? Well, because I guess I'm sinful and wicked. Like that's something's I have a sin nature issue. Interesting fact about the sin offering, Leviticus 6:27. It says, "Whatever touches its flesh, this offering, shall be holy." So there's an offering that says that here's the offering, whatever touches it becomes holy. Now, generally speaking, when you touch blood, you become unclean. But the sin offering, you touch that, you become holy. That's interesting, isn't it? And you find that there's this flip, that our blood, the fallen blood of mankind, has an uncleanness quality to it. But the blood of Christ, it cleanses. You touch this, you become clean. If the blood was brought inside the tabernacle, because sometimes with the sin offering, they'd bring it into the tabernacle, sometimes they wouldn't, it depended on what it was for. But anytime the blood goes into the tabernacle, now the rest of the meat has specific details about it. Let's look in Leviticus 6:30. No sin offering shall be eaten from which any blood is brought into the tent of meeting to make atonement in the holy place. It shall be burned up with fire. This, for instance, happened on the Day of Atonement. Specifically, the Day of Atonement, they would go into the actual temple and they put it either on the altar of incense, or in the case of the Day of Atonement, actually go into the actual Holy of Holies and put it on the Ark of the Covenant. On that day, when that blood went in, that meat can't be eaten. And they would, guess what they would do it? They would take it outside the camp and they'd burn it with fire. So the further in the blood goes, the further out the meat goes to be burned and destroyed. Leviticus 16:27, it says, "And the bull for the sin offering and the goat for the sin offering, whose blood was brought in to make atonement in the holy place, shall be carried outside the camp. Their skin and their flesh and their dung shall be burned up with fire." No part of them can be used. All going to be completely burned up. Hebrews 13, verses 11 and 12, it tells us what the symbolism is. It says, "For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy places by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin," the sin offering, "are burned outside the camp. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood." It's almost like the worse the sin is, the further out you got to take the sacrifice. But the blood goes in, but the meat goes out. Christ, he's crucified outside the gate, outside Jerusalem. Yet when he dies, the veil is ripped, the offering is presented, and the way is made open. And this is all pictured, specific typology relating to the manner in which the sacrifices take place. What I'm saying is, the Bible legitimizes my adventure here in looking at the way the sacrifices look as how they relate to Christ, because Hebrews was doing it 2,000 years ago. Okay, finally we have the last of the 5 offerings, the guilt or the trespass offering. Some translations will say guilt, some will say trespass. So just recognize what translation you're in. This is going to be kind of towards the end of chapter 5, and then it definitely throughout chapters 6. And then there's more details of all these offerings in Leviticus 7, and they pop up as they talk about the feast days. They'll talk about the burnt and peace and all that. It kind of goes throughout the book. But here we are, Leviticus 7:7, it says this. "The guilt offering is just like the sin offering. There is one law for them. The priest who makes atonement with it shall have it." So if the thing was not being brought into the holy place, then the priest could eat of.
I don't know what that means. Why he just said good game. That means that he's going to slam into someone usually. And the person who it looks like he would slam into is me. When I could have killed him, that's...
These things. So the guilt offering is like the sin offering. The two are clustered together. Whereas the other 3, the burnt, the peace, and the grain, they're clustered together as being similar as well. And that's kind of, I think, a typical Jewish understanding of it. They would look at the 3 burnt, peace, and grain as being like fellowship offerings, offerings in relationship with God, whereas the sin and the trespass were offerings to get relationship with God, because they deal with a broken relationship. Let's look at Leviticus 5, verse 14, where we read about this. "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, if anyone commits a breach of faith and sins unintentionally in any of the holy things of the Lord, he shall bring to the Lord as his compensation a ram without blemish out of the flock, valued in silver shekels according to the shekel of the sanctuary for a guilt offering. He shall also make restitution for what he has done amiss in the holy thing, and shall add a 5th to it, and give it to the priest. And the priest shall make atonement for him with the ram of the guilt offering, and he shall be forgiven." So this is the first time there's an offering where there's a sense of restitution added. It's like you sinned, and not only is there an offering, but you got to like pay back what you didn't do. Maybe they were supposed to bring an offering and they didn't, so they sinned about the holy things. So they not only bring the offering, but they bring more.
Follow
It
for
goes on
follow?
to apply this to theft as well.
I don't know, man.
You steal from someone,
What type of content do you make?
when you restore it, you have to bring a trespass offering or a guilt offering for your specific sin. Remember, it's not corporate, it's about your specific sin situation. So I bring a trespass offering, but if I like stole Melissa's like car, then I have
Call
to
of Duty and IRL
which I am
stuff?
doing later today.
I'll check out your channel. I'm not logged into my account right now. You live right now? Ha! Live right now? Yes.
Yes.
Nice. Oh shit. One sec. I gotta mute this real quick. One sec. I gotta make a move here. Sure, man. I'll follow you. What can I? I'll have to log into my account though.
Thinking about that. It's on my mind. I steal a card, then I have to give it back plus a fifth or more.
Oh.
Sometimes if you stole certain things, you give even more in the scriptures. But I have to give you even more. But I'd also have to have an offering to God because I sinned against you and him. So this is the only offering where it talks about restitution being made or paying back for something you did wrong and doing an offering. Interesting. What's the biggest difference between the sin and the guilt offerings?
You keep grinding too, bro.
One of them fixes the sinner, and the other one fixes the situation caused by sin. And to me, those are two different issues. See, I know when I sin, I need God to fix me, but I also know I caused a problem, and I'm like, Lord, what about the problem I caused?
There you go.
So the trespass or guilt offering deals with the situation, not just the sinner. The guilt offering includes fixing the problem that sin caused. Jesus, we read in Romans chapter 8 about how he not only forgives us of our sin.
I'll watch your content when I'm done streaming, all right?
Which is worldwide problem. Romans 8, look at our hope for God restoring, bringing restitution to creation. Romans 8:19, it says, "For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation's been groaning together in pains of childbirth until now, and not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies," that this restoration that's going to finally happen. We read about this in Revelation at the end of the book, the best part, about the restoration of all things. Don't lose sight of this. Jesus not only forgives, he's going to make it better. He not only forgives us corporately and individually, but he's going to deal with our sin issues. Of course, it's a process. Like the payment's been made, but the process of restoration is something we're now waiting for. So the sin offering was corporate or nature related, and the trespass offering was individual and occasion related, specific sin occasions. But again, there's a limit. It will not deal with high-handed sins. I know that's a phrase we don't use, high-handed. High-handed, it's like presumptuous sins. There's another word we don't use.
I'm surprised why this guy hasn't taken No, I don't want to do that trade. Send him a heart so he knows I'm not setting up to attack him.
Willful sins? In fact, that's kind of what Hebrews talking about when it says, he who sins willfully, there's no sacrifice for you. It's talking about the Old Testament law. There is no sacrifice for willful sins. This is why when David slept with Bathsheba, he loved the law, he loved God's word, and he knew it. And he knew there was no sacrifice for what he did. And so he writes Psalm 51, and he's heartbroken, and now you understand why. And he says, in Psalm 51, in his recovery and his seeking and crying out to God, he says in Psalm 51:16, You will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. I'm the king of Israel. I got plenty of bulls and goats. But there is no sacrifice for what I've done. You will not be pleased with a burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. God, you will not despise. So this is the thing he offers. He goes, I will just humbly repent, and I will just say, God, you have to take care of my sin because I can't do it. So we see the failure of the law to deal with sins that every single human commits. That's what Hebrews talks about. It's the shortcoming of this law. It was never intended to cover all of your sins. It was meant to be like, here's a law for people who will be good. And now here's a savior because people aren't. And that's what points us to Christ. Don't take this stuff for granted. The sacrifice was to deal with sin, and it sets the stage for Jesus. These sacrifices in Leviticus, they give us the meaning of Christ. Without them, with the book of Leviticus, that I've heard people say, we could improve the Bible if we just tore out the book of Leviticus. Of course, they're non-believers who say that, generally speaking. Most of them. Well, probably all of them. But turn to Isaiah 52, and let's look at this beautiful messianic passage. Now that you have all this sacrifice content in your head, you're thinking about the burnt offering and the peace offering and the guilt offering, and you're thinking of all these things. You're thinking about how blood could cleanse, how it would normally make you unclean, but in the context of a pure sacrifice, it could actually make you clean. Look at Isaiah 52 and see the sacrificial language in this beautiful prophecy of Messiah, of what Jesus would do. Isaiah 52:13. It says, Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up and shall be exalted. As many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. So shall he sprinkle many nations. Now, if you didn't have Leviticus and Exodus, you wouldn't know what sprinkle many nations even means. You see, when they inaugurated this law, this Levitical law, they sprinkled the nation of Israel with the blood of a sacrifice to consecrate the nation. They never sprinkled many nations. Jesus, he sprinkles many nations. In other words, he offers blood sacrifice to atone for the sins of the whole world. Mm-hmm. Here in Isaiah 52. As you read on, I'll skip to verse 10 of Isaiah 53. Look at this and tell me if you can catch. I'll see if you catch it. Something I taught you today that's right here. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul, he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities.
Bear their iniquities.
Did anybody catch a phrase in there that connects to the specific sacrifices in Leviticus? I'll read it again. We have, I'm sorry, I skipped ahead of my notes here. Verse 10, yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt. That is a guilt offering. That is one of the 5 offerings we talked about, isn't it? The 5th one is the guilt offering for the specific sins of individuals and their impact in the world. He becomes a guilt offering. In the Hebrew, you can actually search it. It really is the same phrase for guilt offering that's used in Leviticus. Isaiah is speaking about how the Messiah will come and he will be the human guilt offering is offered for the people to make us righteous because he'll bear our iniquities, it says in verse 11. Well, back to Leviticus chapter 10, verse 17. I'll read this to you. It speaks of the high priest. I'm not going to get into a whole bunch of the high priest stuff. Well, not all of it.
I would just kill Blue this round.
I'll skip ahead here, but Leviticus 10:17, it says about the high priest that they were supposed to eat. One of the reasons why they would eat of the offerings of the sanctuary was so that they may, quote, bear the iniquity of the congregation to make atonement for them before the Lord. You see, they would get the sin and the guilt offerings. Here's where they confess their sins on these animals. Like as if their sin is being transferred to the animal. That's the symbolism. And the priest partakes of it because it's like he's got to bear the sin. Because Jesus, he bore the sin of many. He has, according to Isaiah 53, he has the priestly and the sacrifice position. They're all symbolism of him. I think it's just amazing. Absolutely amazing. At the end of Isaiah 53, it says in verse 12, "Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors." There is one time in the Bible where a guilt offering is presented for a whole group of people. Remember, it's only ever presented for one person, never groups. Except in Isaiah 53, where the Messiah, the future guilt offering, is presented for all the people. He bore the sins of many. He is the one guilt offering that can do that. Okay, a couple more things. In closing, well, closing-ish. I don't know how much I got here. There's commonalities among the offerings. Most of them involve a death, and it's like a life for a life kind of thing. Jesus, his life is eternal. He gives us eternal life. He's the elevated version of that. Always the person offering kills the animal. And so when we see who kills Jesus, what we're seeing is not who we should go pick on. We're seeing who Jesus died for. Jews and Gentiles alike. He died for the whole world. That's the idea. Mm-hmm. The priest, his job is to present the offering, not to kill it, but to present it to the Lord. Well, Jesus, he takes the position of the offering and the tabernacle and the priest. He does all those jobs. And so he presents the offering. We are the ones who kill him, so to speak. It always happens at the tabernacle. It has to happen there, which represents Christ, the tabernacle. All these offerings take place in that same location, except for when the offerings got to go all the way in to the presence of God. Well, that's when it has to be taken outside the camp and destroyed, and that's where Christ died. And again, they're insufficient. That's an important feature of the Levitical law. It didn't cover all the sins. None of them are forgiven ultimately by the Levitical law. They need something better, and that's the point of this law, and that's what David's crying about in Psalm 51. They were offered for two different general things. Two of the offerings were offered to gain communion with God. That's which two? To get communion with God, to get right with God. Be the sin offering and the guilt offering. Those are about getting right with God. There's a sin between me and God. Well, those two offerings deal with sin, the sin and guilt offering. The other three are about being in communion with God. The burnt offering, the grain offering, the peace offering. So we have the sin and the trespass. They deal with my sin individually, our sin corporately, and its impact in the world. The burnt grain and peace offerings. Well, the peace offering, Jesus is our peace. The grain offering, Jesus says, "I'm the bread of life. Do this in remembrance of me." And you'd burn a memorial portion of the grain offering. And it would give us fellowship with not only God, but with each other. And then we have the burnt offering. And we're to offer as well, just like Jesus offered himself wholly to God. You're to offer yourself wholly to God. Romans 12:1. "I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship." Not to be conformed to this world, but to be living fully and completely for God. Not to just be a doctrinal Christian. I have the doctrines of Christianity, right? But to be a follower of Jesus Christ in all that I do. Now, another little tidbit I'll add. In the order these offerings were given, it was always consistent. If there was a sin offering or a trespass offering, these were always offered before the other fellowship-related offerings, the burnt, the peace, and the grain. First you deal with the sin and the trespass, then you can have the other ones. So when you read through Leviticus, sometimes they're brought together as a group. It's all.
If I was purple, I would go boom, put in here, boom, put right there, stack right there, and then let blue walk out. I don't think that's what he's going to do, though.
Always the sin.
Oh, maybe he
first,
is.
Not the burnt or the grain or the peace. Now, last I'll say is this. None of these offerings are actually happening today. You know that? None of them are happening today. In Israel, there is no temple. And since the destruction of the temple in 70 AD,
there's about to be. I kind of screwed
They have
Purple's plan there, which is funny. Oh no! What the fuck? I was telling him that he could attack this, and then we'd both have a +5.
ceased, and there's been no significant Jewish group even trying to do these offerings. So what do the Orthodox Jews do? Someone says, I'm an Orthodox Jew. I followed the Orthodox Jewish, scriptures. And you're like, yeah, but you don't do it. I mean, like, you have the whole book of Leviticus, and you apply it as much as I do, which is not. Like, you have no Levitical priesthood. You have no offerings. So the rabbinical Jews do other things. When the Day of Atonement comes, they do good works, and they offer prayers, and they offer offerings, and they're trying to present good works instead of sacrifices. So that modern day Judaism would be unrecognizable to ancient Jews. The other option is that you have Christ, who is the sin and the trespass and the grain and the peace and the burnt offering, who is the fulfillment of these things. It kind of breaks my heart when I realize that a lot of modern Jews, what they have is a shadow of a shadow.
Is Purple gonna kill me?
What they have now is a shadow of the actual Old Testament law and the following of those things, instead of what Messianic people have, which is the fulfillment of those things. Christ came and he's the fulfillment. And when you realize that contrast, it hopefully makes your heart kind of break for the Jewish people. You're like, man, I just want you guys to know your Messiah. Yeah, please push me aside and come teach us these things better than I do. I'm perfectly happy to have you do that. But he's the fulfillment, and instead you have like a wispy, stripped down version of even Judaism. It's not what was there. Instead, we have the fulfillment in Christ. He is our peace, All right. So that's the first 7 chapters of Leviticus. I hope that became interesting to you all of a sudden, if it wasn't already. And hopefully you see the symbolism there. There's more there, and you can dig in and find that stuff on your own and perhaps theorize and ponder things and search it out yourself. And that's kind of the goal of the series, is to not give you every picture of Christ, but to stir up an appreciation and a knowledge of this.
Is he going to kill me?
So you can find it on your own. Let's pray. Father, we just want to lift up around the world those who are holding to the Old Testament, those who hold to the Tanakh, yet they don't really do it. There's really no actual obedience to many of the things that are written there, because it's just not even possible right now. We pray, Lord, that they would see that Jesus Christ has come and he is the fulfillment, and that God has not left them without a sacrifice. He stopped them because the sacrifice has been made. It's been accomplished, that Christ, he offered himself once and for all. We pray, Lord, that there be more and more Jewish people coming to Messiah, coming to put their trust in their Messiah. And we ask, Lord, that we would have more and more eyes to see the goodness of Jesus Christ throughout the Old Testament, and how you have written the tapestry of the story of the person of the Son of God throughout the pages of Scripture. In Jesus' name, amen.
I'm working on this new case. A missing scientist. Frozen solid. I've seen that before.
Here's what I would like to just remind us. We're in the middle of our Jesus in the Old Testament series. Actually, we're towards the end of our Jesus in the Old Testament series. If you're watching online, I will put a link in the video description that has the entire playlist.
Right.
It's like 19 videos so far.
Home. Is he gonna take red out of this pocket? Is that his plan there? No. Weird. Try cooking. All the Psalms? How can you explain all the Psalms in 10 minutes? That doesn't make any sense. That's way too much to explain. Like, it probably takes over an hour to explain a lot of Psalms. Debunking every communist argument. I can't believe that they're letting me hold this much. Like, that's crazy. How is this person going over Super Tuesday? I do not get what blue is doing. Alright, I take that 6 out on next turn. I do not see anything that I feel like really watching here.
Introducing Milo's Rewards, the new way to unlock savings from the palm of your hand. With every purchase, all loyalty...
Sadism. So before I get into what Poseidism is,
Poseidism?
I need
Oh,
to
I know
explain
about this.
Trotskyism, which Poseidism is a sort of subset of. So
Isn't Poseidism where you think that we need to, like, blow up the world? Or, like, basically have a nuclear holocaust for us to be able to get true communism?
let's wind back to 1924, and the revolution is complete, comrades. We did it. Oops, Lenin just died. So now we have both Stalin and Trotsky, who both had very different views on how to run the Soviet Union. Well, some infighting happens, and Stalin comes out on top. Meanwhile, Trotsky limps over onto Mexico, where he has an affair with artist Frida Kahlo, and then gets an ice pick in the head. But rewinding a bit. The initial split between Stalin and Trotsky created a divide amongst communist movements in the world. In fact, one that even continues to this day on irrelevant Twitter threads. So most communist movements ended up going with Moscow and expelled any Trotsky supporters, who then ended up founding their own communist parties. Trotskyism took a communist but anti-Stalinist line, and advocated political opposition to Stalinism, which they saw as leading to an entrenched bureaucracy and to development of a new ruling class under the guise of Communist Party leadership. They even founded a Fourth International to rival the Third International, but then it shattered into a bunch of ideologically 95% the same splinter groups that still hated each other because leftist infighting. But then there's a lot of merging back together and then shattering again, confused, yeah, so am I. Okay, that's cool and all, but what does this have to do with bathing the world in nuclear hellfire? Well, the Poseidists are one of those splinter groups that branched off from mainstream Trotskyism. So once again, we must rewind the clock a bit to 1912 Argentina, where J. Poseidis was born to Italian immigrant parents. Poseidis tried to start a career as a footballer, but when that failed, he went to his only available alternative, left-wing politics. He gained a small following going around South America establishing Trotskyist parties, and eventually the Latin American bureau of the Fourth International. So remember leftist infighting? Well, yeah, in 1953, following the breakup of the Fourth International, Poseidis and the Latin American Bureau sided with Michael Pablo and the International Secretariat. However, during this time, Poseidis and his followers began quarreling with the rest of the Secretariat over disagreements on issues like nuclear war, and in 1962, completely separated to found the Poseidis International. This new organization had branches all over the world, but were mostly concentrated in South America, and started to gain notoriety for their
That wasn't good. How long have I had that on?
interesting beliefs. They took part in guerrilla movements in Brazil, Guatemala, and
I can't believe that. I think I had it on my.
They fell to favor with other guerrillas for, in true Trotskyist style, diverting funds intended for the armed struggle to produce a newspaper in Europe. Now, to illustrate how batshit these guys are, they got banned from Cuba after the revolution for saying Fidel Castro did not go far enough. They developed a cult of personality around Poseidis, which was considered extreme even by Trotskyist standards. Any discussion within Poseidis circles on a given topic was immediately ended when J. Poseidis decided on a particular interpretation. According to one former Italian comrade, their meetings would consist of listening to the latest tapes sent by Poseidis. Discussions would never go beyond finding ways to understand better and explain clearly what was said in a given text by their leader. He was even referred to as Dear Master by a resolution by the Poseidis International a year after his death. But now, what you probably clicked on this video for. Yeah, they were really enthusiastic about nuclear holocaust. They believed that nuclear war was not only likely.
Alright, I'm just gonna slam that.
But also desirable. For in their view, nuclear war was the supreme opportunity for the forces of the world revolution. A devastating nuclear winter would represent the final settlements of accounts of socialism against the capitalist system. Basically, the logic was that civilization would be destroyed, but everyone would come out of the rubble and embrace, quotation marks, true communism for some reason. I don't think they ever got the memo on how nuclear winters make building a new perfect society pretty difficult. Now, even though they didn't believe that China or the Soviets represented true communism, the Poseidists were known to write to their leaders asking them to blanket the planet in nuclear hellfire. They were also really into UFOs. Basically, their view was that UFOs are proof of advanced alien civilization. And since advances in society come about from advances in technology, these extraterrestrials must come from a socialist society. And they also do not come to Earth because we are just primitive capitalists and deformed bureaucratic socialists. Now, the former Italian Poseidus from earlier said that ufology was never of great importance to them, as they had more important concerns, like nuclear war. Also, they believe that humans could communicate to dolphins, and that humans will ultimately reproduce asexually, like amoeba. Now, after Poseidus died, the group pretty much withered away, with the only active Poseidus party now being in Uruguay, which got a whopping 0.1% of the vote in the Uruguayan elections of 2004. Thanks to patrons Andy Luke, Emerson Salmerio Rubio, Link the Bets 24, Sean from Nerdy Loins, Skylar Weston, and Zyma.
That was kind of a shitty video. $16 plus 9. Alex Jones. Is he gonna try to hold? I don't know what the fuck they're gonna do here.
Sometimes I need to paraphrase.
It's easy to make your work clearer and more
This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one website building platform. What I am now going to relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. I shall describe what will happen, what must necessarily happen. The triumph of nihilism. Hopefully, by now, most people are aware that Nietzsche was not a nihilist. In fact, he was heavily opposed to nihilism, and he saw its advent as a great catastrophe that would befall Europe and indeed the whole world. The misunderstanding probably arose from the fact that Nietzsche wrote a great deal about nihilism, and more specifically about how nihilism seems to find its way into every domain of culture. It does so via something Nietzsche called the aesthetic ideal. The aesthetic ideal is one of those elusive concepts that escape a quick definition. It's the form of nihilism without a determinate content. The content is determined by its surroundings. Like a chameleon, it takes the color of whatever is around it. What does that mean? Nietzsche explores the aesthetic ideal in the 3rd essay of his masterpiece, The Genealogy of Morals. And the entire essay, the whole 3rd part of the book, is dedicated to the singular question, what is the meaning of aesthetic ideals? By way of arriving at an answer, Nietzsche explores the myriad ways the aesthetic ideal takes shape in different domains of human culture: art, religion, philosophy, and science. In this video, we will follow in Nietzsche's footsteps and discuss how the aesthetic ideal, in other words, how nihilism, infects everything, from religion to art to science to philosophy. So strap in, pour yourself some coffee, black of course, and join us for a Nietzschean odyssey through European culture, Wagnerian art, Christian religion, Schopenhauerian philosophy, and finally, self-denying modern science. First stop, Wagner. This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Squarespace is an all-in-one website building platform. Whether you're creating a website for personal use or you're managing a brand, Squarespace has you covered. If you want to keep track of books you've read, or jot down summaries or notes, and keep them organized on a list of what you've read with a summary always handy to refresh your memory, Squarespace is the perfect solution for you. You set up a Squarespace website, and within minutes you can find the perfect blog template to do so. You don't need any programming or coding knowledge either, as it's easy and intuitive to get started using their Fluid engine. Just drag and drop. They also offer a huge library of extensions, so you can customize. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. When Nietzsche traces the ascetic ideal throughout these different domains of art, religion, science, and philosophy, he does so through attacking representatives of that domain. By attacking the part, he attacks the whole. He looks for types, individuals who contain within them the essence of that entire domain. In the domain of philosophy, for example, he takes Schopenhauer as the archetype of the entire field, of its essence and its completion. And when Nietzsche discusses art, specifically of course art in the 19th century, he talks about Wagner as the most perfect representative of what art essentially is, what it means, and what it tries to accomplish. It's easy enough to see why. Not only was Nietzsche intimately familiar with Wagner's art, he knew the man personally. They were friends. But above all, Wagner was considered the superstar artist of his time, of unrivaled influence and scope. For better or worse, Wagner's influence on music and stagecraft, and by extension drama in general, is unmistakable and long-lasting. And this influence was already apparent in Wagner's own time. In Der Ring des Nibelungen, Nietzsche went so far as to anticipate a revival of German art and the German spirit, awakening the degenerate German culture from their long slumber, an embrace of life and sensuality in the manner of the Greeks, a revival of the great Greek theater festivals of Dionysus. In other words, Wagner's art would spark a revolution. But then, Wagner made his final opera, his swan song, and his crowning artistic achievement, the infamous Parsifal, with a plot that deals with themes opposite of the Ring. Gone is the rebellious spirit, the embrace of sensuality, the resurgence of virility and a warrior ethos. In Parsifal, the gods are not overthrown as they are in the Ring. In Parsifal, God reigns supreme. Parsifal is ruined by sensuality and only attains redemption when he becomes chaste again. Even worse, the entire plot of the opera is set in motion because a formerly chaste king is seduced by an evil seductress, femme fatale. The message in Parsifal is clear. Chastity is good. Chastity has redemptive power. Chastity can save us. We will release a full analysis of Parsifal in due time. For the purposes of this video, however, the important thing to keep in mind is that Wagner seems to celebrate chastity in Parsifal, which is a radical departure from his earlier works. The Ring even celebrates the incestuous relationship between a brother and a sister, scandalizing polite society at the time. And Tristan und Isolde, the opera right before Parsifal, although the work is a complex one, also champions the redemptive power of erotic love. These themes are turned upside down in Parsifal, where everything bad that happens is the result of erotic desire and everything good that happens is the result of chastity. For Nietzsche, this incitement to chastity is an attack on nature, an attack on life itself. It is the ascetic ideal communicated through artistic language, the degeneracy of nihilism put to stage. For Parsifal is a work of perfidy, of vindictiveness, of a secret attempt to poison the presuppositions of life. A bad work. The preaching of chastity remains an incitement to anti-nature. I despise everyone who does not experience Parsifal as an attempted assassination of basic ethics. The plot of Parsifal centers on the magical castle Montsalvat, where the Knights of the Grail live in seclusion and protect the Holy Grail, the chalice from which Jesus Christ drank during the Last Supper and which collected his blood after his crucifixion. But the catch is that the castle only shows itself to people with a pure spirit. At the start of the opera, Parsifal, a young boy who grew up in the wild after his mother died an early death, discovers the castle almost by accident. The castle is visible to him because his spirit is pure, because he has never known the touch of a woman. Remember, he's spent his entire life in the forest, divorced from civilization and human contact. But in the second act of the opera, Parsifal is seduced by the evil witch Gundri. Eventually, she kisses him, and with this kiss, suddenly within him, the sexual impulse awakens. In the stage directions, Wagner writes down how Parsifal reacts to the kiss. Parsifal suddenly starts up with a gesture of the utmost terror. His demeanor expresses some fearful change. He presses his hands hard against his heart, as if to master an agonizing pain. And Parsifal exclaims, "Here, here, in my heart is the flame, the longing, the terrible longing, which seizes and grips all my senses. O torment of love, how everything trembles, quakes and quivers in sinful desire." Note also the Buddhist and Schopenhauerian use of language. Parsifal's suffering stems from terrible longing and sinful desire. What happens here is that Parsifal becomes privy to the evil of the world, the sexual impulse and the longing desire that underpins it. The second act of the opera ends, and with the third act we open with a time skip. Many years have passed. Off-screen, Parsifal had to engage in a Herculean effort of good deeds to purge his soul of the defilement brought upon it by the witch's kiss. The castle is no longer visible to him. He cannot find it anymore, and he needs to embark on a journey of soul purification to cleanse himself and become pure again. All of this is completely counter to Nietzsche, and indeed counter to the early Wagner too, who championed sexuality as liberating, not as a source of some kind of defilement. This complete 180 on the part of Wagner, this promotion of chastity and the abundant Christian imagery in Parsifal, was for Nietzsche a sure sign that Wagner, at last, in his old age, fell victim to Schopenhauer and Christianity. But more importantly, he fell victim to the ascetic ideal. He became anti-life, anti-nature. In other words, he became a nihilist. Parsifal, for Nietzsche, was the artistic embodiment of the ascetic ideal, a complete victory of nihilism in the artistic domain. Richard Wagner, ostensibly the most triumphant creature alive, as a matter of fact, though, a cranky and desperate decadent, suddenly fell helpless and broken on his knees before the Christian cross. Was there no German at that time who had eyes to see, and the sympathy in his soul to feel the ghastly nature of this spectacle? Was I the only one who suffered from it?
This has been the most extraordinary experience of my entire life.
Are you ready for it?
I'll be your host this evening. My name is Taylor, and welcome to the Eras Tour.
You're making me feel excellent right now. Are you ready for it?
This is one of my favorites.
Here's the plan. You sneak past the guards and grab the treasure.
What are you gonna do?
I'm gonna shop at thriftbooks.com, but there's millions of books for under $5.
Even adventures?
Adventures, fantasy, anything.
Okay, new plan.
And speaking of the Christian cross, we need to discuss why Nietzsche said that Christianity is a nihilistic religion. Throughout his works, Nietzsche has criticized almost every aspect of the Christian faith. Of course, this critique finds its most powerful expression in one of his final works, The Antichrist. We've done a big video on that work specifically if you're curious to learn more about the nitty-gritty details of Nietzsche's criticisms. For the purposes of this video, where we're talking about the ascetic ideal as a nihilistic psychological phenomenon that seeps into different domains of human culture, we need to take a more general perspective. And for that, we turn to Beyond Good and Evil, and specifically to something Nietzsche called the religious neurosis. There is within man an instinct for the religious, a need for faith, or rather, a yearning for some kind of metaphysics, something beyond himself, a justification for his life. Existence needs an orientation, or, as Nietzsche puts the phrase, man needs a goal. For the mature Nietzsche, this goal is the accumulation of power, the venting of one's strength, a discharge of virility. But what happens when one is infected with a religious neurosis? A strange inversion of values occurs. Wherever the religious neurosis has appeared on Earth so far, we find it connected with three dangerous prescriptions as to regimen: solitude, fasting, and sexual abstinence. In the history of mankind, this is a relatively new phenomenon. The religions of primitive man, insofar as we can know anything about them, probably did not prescribe fasting and abstinence. In the context of prehistoric tribes, such a prescription would be disastrous for the continued existence of the tribe, where food was scarce already, and discouraging procreation would simply expedite the extinction of the tribe. A very real risk in Paleolithic times, when life was nasty, brutal, and short. We can support our hypothesis by looking at the famous Venus of Willendorf. It's a limestone figure, around 30,000 years old, and thought to represent some kind of fertility deity. Evidently, these humans from 30,000 years ago weren't really all that concerned with chastity. The exaggerated sexual features, on the contrary, show a concern with not enough procreation, let alone too much. An understandable concern for a small-time human tribe just trying to survive in the Paleolithic. The point is, this statue celebrates, or at least doesn't condemn, the human instinct for procreation. And neither did the Romans and the Greeks. The overabundance of phallic symbols and the preoccupation with sex is well attested in both Greek and Roman worlds. No, it seems like the celebration of chastity, as opposed to virility, was introduced in Europe through Christianity. And when Christianity supplanted Greco-Roman paganism, something else disappeared also: sacrifice. Nietzsche makes an interesting observation about the practice of sacrifice. He calls it the ladder of religious cruelty, in which, broadly speaking, three big movements can be distinguished. First,
I was surprised about that because he didn't attack me the first time, beginner. Master, expert. What time is it? I gotta go to the bathroom real quick. I'll be right back. Oh. All right, I'm back. I'm back. All right. Did you guys see that one of the whistleblowers for Boeing just randomly ended up dead? Whistleblower for Boeing. It's pretty crazy. This was after the whole thing about the door blowing off from from one of the aircrafts. Luckily, it wasn't flying really high or anything, but it was pretty crazy. How Reagan ruined everything. I mean, I will admit, there is quite a few things that I don't like that Reagan did. You know what? Am I not subscribed to him anymore?
You'll be delighted to know that there is an arms race taking place right now to get access to your brain. And it seems like Elon Musk is leading this arms race. He is working overtime to figure out a way to drill a hole in your skull and get his
Well, he's already testing it on humans.
Reaching into your very imagination itself.
This is very scary stuff.
Elon Musk
in my
has just
opinion.
installed his Neuralink in the first human subject.
Oh, yep.
So what I'm going to do today is explore some of the possible future outcomes that this event may lead to. Perhaps you may think it's not that big of a deal, but I want you to consider how big of a deal the iPhone was. I'm sure your grandparents found it strange that you spent all your time staring at this thing in your hand instead of going outside. And that just shows you the power that this new technology has had on our generations. And sadly for us, we might be entering into the boomer stage of our life cycle. It was fun being a millennial, a zoomer, being the butt of all the jokes, being the new kids who are addicted to these new things, the phones. We probably thought to ourselves, it can't get much worse than this. We nearly took pride in how screwed up we were. But now we might see how the next generations are going to outplay us. They won't be addicted to a phone in their hand. They will be merged with a machine in their mind. So let us dive into Neuralink and what it means for the psychology of the future. And at the end, of course, I'll wax philosophical and make some elaborate speculations about what all this might mean and where we are going. I made a video a couple of months back about why artificial intelligence is starting to get terrifying, mainly because it is now being used in analytics to be able to break down people's brainwaves and accurately replicate what people's brains are thinking. And we get an interesting character like Elon Musk saying to us that he's going to buy Twitter to support all our freedom. And then he's also building Neuralink, which seems to be the ultimate expression of this attempt to cross the brain technology barrier. You see, technology interacts with our brains from a distance. It has to go through our eyes or our ears. We use the portals of our senses in order to communicate with technology. But Neuralink bypasses all that. Neuralink drills a hole in your skull and creates essentially a new portal, a new set of eyes, a new set of ears. We're gaining a sixth sense through Neuralink, where it interacts directly with your brain. Now, let us get into the actual nuts and bolts of this, because it is absolutely fascinating what is going on. Neuralink is doing one of these innovations in science that we look back in history and we celebrate the airplane, the rise of nukes, the rise of advanced missiles, the rise of cars, the rise of telephones. All this stuff was absolutely mind-blowing when it came about, and we're living through our own version of this. Like, this Neuralink stuff is absolutely crazy. Of course, it's not appearing in the way that we expected. We were expecting maybe a new car or something like this. It seems like some of the biggest innovations are happening with the attempts to drill holes inside of our minds. Now, what's amazing about engineering is that all steps of engineering are actually quite simple. Everything is understandable when you break it down into small enough parts. The problem, of course, is all of these parts have to go together in an incredibly complicated way, which is what makes it so dense and difficult. And so Neuralink is not esoteric. It actually has a logic to it. It's a set of procedures that make sense, that allows for Elon Musk to drill a hole in your brain and put a little machine in there that can read your thoughts. That sounds absolutely like magic. It literally is. He's calling it telepathy, which is a magical term. But it has a logic to it. And the most interesting one, of course, is how does it cross the brain technology barrier? And all it is Neuralink has this set of tiny little hair-like threads, these electrodes, that touch your brain and therefore are able to take the electricity being created by your brain and bring it into the device so it can read it. It's that simple. These tiny little threads are like little nerve endings that dangle out of this piece of technology that, you stick inside of your skull. And they are biocompatible, which means that they're not going to be rejected by your brain or cause inflammation. And it is done with a robot that is so incredibly precise that it won't damage any of your tissues. Now, this is obviously what they say. I'll let you be the first person to get this thing plugged into your fucking noggin. And so, in order for you to get a Neuralink put inside of your head, it does involve you getting a surgery. That's one thing to be clear about. Now, think about this. This is going to become fascinating, When you bought your phone, it was a sort of introduction for you into the new world of technology. I remember before I had a phone, I actually felt very liberated and free. I was much more of a nature boy, much more of a hippie. And then once I got a phone, it inevitably started to suck me into the internet reality and made me a little bit terminally online. And it was a sort of introduction and initiation into a cult, into a new form of consciousness, because the phone gave me access to all this information that made me red pilled, that made me see reality in a way that most normies can't see it, or maybe aren't as plugged in as me, or aren't in the spaces on the internet that I tend to be a denizen for, tend to frequent. And this is very informal. You buy a phone and it's a big deal. You spend all this money and you have this thing. This Neuralink is going to become way more dramatic, because in order for you to get it, you have to go and have a surgery. And it's almost like a religious ritual of sorts, It's like indoctrination into the cult. And this is not a joke, because the whole point of ritual or initiation is that afterwards you're never the same again. And there's a sort of psychological transformation that takes place. Thank you very much, Carol Young, for teaching me these things. And this is precisely what we see happening with this Neuralink, is that you go under a general anesthetic, and they put you face down, and they drill a small hole. They peel off some of your skin and then drill a small hole inside of your skull. And then they get this giant robot, which is guided by this super precision of this professional. And they stick all these electrodes in and make sure everything is working. And then they put the small device in behind your ears. And this is the signal transmitter. It's almost like a little Wi-Fi thing in the back of your head. And then then they cover it up. And then you are all of a sudden now a member of the Neuralink clan. You're initiated into the cult of the future. You have joined the age of Aquarius. Of course, that's what they're going to tell you. They're going to pat you on the back and be like, well done, you're now one of us. They're going to do some type of Star Trek hand sign and, high-five you and walk you out the building. And then when you leave, they'll start cackling, rubbing their hands together. Bill Gates will pull down the mask. He was the surgeon. He'll start laughing, a booming laugh. The Antichrist himself will step out and say, ha ha ha, another child of my transhuman plan. And then he'll turn around, still cackling, and throw a dart at a picture of your head that was pinned up in the surgery room. And the dart will land bullseye right on the spot where you got his philosopher's stone injected into your mind. But whether we are entering the age of Aquarius or there's some type of Antichrist conspiracy at play, this is going to happen. In fact, this is happening. Only a couple of weeks ago, Elon Musk's Neuralink implanted its first device into a person. My friends, it is here. shown you videos before of monkeys who have had this device implanted into their brains, who are able to play ping pong without their hands. It works. It has worked on animals, and now it has been put inside man. And so we have some interesting questions we must ask ourselves about where this goes, what type of powers this will gift mankind. Well, of course, this is not happening in a vacuum. This ability to cross the skull barrier happened as far back as 2018. So there was another tool called BrainGate, and it took 2 men and 1 woman who had these grids, these electrodes, implanted over part of the motor cortex. So this is the part of your brain that controls movement, and this is what Neuralink targets as well, because it's trying to get your capacity to connect with this tool and use it almost like a cursor. If you think about how you move a cursor around your laptop, you are moving it with your hands, and it's a movement thing, and you click on things and you click on things and click on things. And so your access to the internet and your interaction with the internet is related to your capacity to move something. So the motor cortex is what they aim for. Now, there's a lot of interesting questions about targeting other areas of the brain for other things, which we'll get into in a minute, but this is the general one. So they go for the motor cortex. Now, these people, once they had this implanted in 2018, were able to use nothing more than their intentions to move a cursor. And they performed 7 common digital tasks. This was including browsing the web, sending emails, and things like this. One participant ordered groceries online and then played a digital piano. Now, what would this be like? Because these people described it as being quite intuitive, quite nice. It actually would involve you having a strong imagination. Your capacity to imagine is what will lead to your nervous system activating these pathways. So to give you an analogy for this, I'm sure you've probably heard of Conor McGregor and his run-up when he was fighting. He would spend a lot of time working on visualization. Now, this is something well known across athletics, well known across the world of musicians, that you don't actually need to practice to get the benefits of training. If you can visualize, you can develop your technique and your skill. Now, just a quick caveat, if you train physically and also visualize, you tend to get the best results. But if you visualize by itself, you tend to get better results than if you just train physically by itself, which is very interesting, because all skill is based on your nervous system, your brain's capacity to remember movement patterns. So when you visualize something, when you imagine something, even if you're not moving, you're actually training your brain to do the action. And it seems like Neuralink is very similar. When you're using something like Neuralink or one of these tools, BrainGate, what you need to do is, in some sense, visualize. Now, I admit this is a little bit speculative, but I'm going off what I'm reading about this. So this is coming from a man who's disabled, and he learned how to write using Neuralink. So a 65-year-old man had these electrodes implanted into the surface of his brain, and they read the electrical activity of the movement part of his brain that controlled hand and finger movements. And although the man was paralyzed from the neck down, all he had to do was imagine writing letters softly with his hand, and the machine had this AI inside of it that was able to figure out the neural patterns that were going on and then translate those into writing, which they could then break down into text. So they could literally take the man's neural patterns and allow him to essentially draw letters like he was handwriting, and then it would process this handwriting and turn it into text, recognizable letters, which you could then program into the internet and communicate. Now, this was the surprising part of it. This happened years and years after a very serious spinal injury. So he hadn't used his hands or his fingers in almost a decade, maybe over a decade. But his thinking to text processes still worked because this part of his brain was still active. And he was able to write 15 words per minute, which is pretty much as fast as somebody his age would write on a smartphone now. It's much slower than the average person on a laptop, but it is just as fast as your boomer dad with one finger tapping on the phone. Now, there's some interesting speculation that comes out of this. This is where things start to get a little bit funky. Imagine if you could save your memories onto a hard drive and then go into this hard drive and upload them. This is kind of the way you think your brain works as it is. But what you get when you remember things is vague impressions. And this is actually well known among neuroscience, that we don't remember things as they actually happened. We tend to distort them quite significantly, to the point where sometimes your memories can be almost entirely false or highly influenced by fabrications and distortions. The emotional tenor of the memories can be exaggerated to mean something that they don't. Trauma is another famous version of this, where something emotionally scarred you, it left a mark upon you, and you make it more significant than it is, or you distort the memory to suit the pain, to give you a narrative that helps reinforce the pain in order to protect yourself from what you perceive to be the threat that hurt you. There's an incredible unreliability of memory. Now imagine if this Neuralink was constantly processing all your thoughts and moving them out of your brain as you were creating your memories and putting them in this special hard drive that essentially recorded them like a film. And so if you wanted to remember something accurately, you would just, go into the hard drive and pull that memory up from that date and that time or whatever it is. Now, how that would work, that is something that would be interesting to explore, but this is what people like Musk claim is possible. Now, I can tell you some technicalities about this, about what I think it may be like. I've already spoken to you about the Pink Floyd song, that the researchers trained an AI to be able to recognize the brain patterns that make up sounds, and then they could effectively replay those brain patterns as audio that vaguely matched the Pink Floyd song. It was clearly the Pink Floyd song, just a little bit muffled. Now, we give that capacity 20 years, 25 years, 50 years to advance, maybe less. And will it be able to replicate that in almost perfect high resolution? Imagine if that AI was able to get brainwaves that weren't just picked up off electrodes that were strapped to somebody's head, but actually drilling inside of their brains, into their brain itself, which is what Neuralink would do, which would be much more accurate neural signaling. If it was able to interpret this and then create almost perfect audio. Well, doesn't that mean that when you have a memory, when you live through something, and you hear sounds that your ears would pick up, that would go into your brain, and when you see things happen, you see a face, you see an incident, a car crash, a tree, the leaves whistling, rustling, the birds whistling, I should be saying, your brain processes all of this. It all goes into your brain and is registered as neural activity. And if you had a Neuralink that was effectively decoding and picking up all this stuff and storing it accurately, why wouldn't it be able to then replicate this stuff? Why wouldn't it be able to generate those memories, recreate those memories based on these signaling, and be able to play it back to you? Let me clarify here. These machines can already read and decode brainwaves that represent sense experiences like audio. They can already do this, just at a low quality. If we get this up to a high enough quality, why wouldn't this Neuralink be able to give you a rendition of your own experiences with the full sense-based experience? Do you understand what this means? Or let's go even a step beyond this. Your reality is always influenced by your consciousness. This is very Carl Jung stuff right here, You have an unconscious. You register many things subconsciously. In the room you're in right now, you're paying attention, staring straight forward, and registering consciously what you're listening to and maybe what you're doing. Say, for example, a lot of people listen to me while they're maybe making food, or maybe they're out working, or maybe they're out walking, or they're out training or something like this. So you're focusing on a task, but there's all sorts of things happening in your surroundings that you're not focusing on that your brain is picking up. The sounds of the birds in the distance, cars going by, people speaking. Like, think about what this tool could do. If you had the Neuralink in, you could go back and listen to a certain scene or a certain situation and actually zone in into all these other details that you missed. You would be able to start to gather the unconscious aspects of things that you forgot. Because remember, your brain registers everything. You only become consciously aware of a small part of it. You focus on things because that's practical. But your brain is processing everything. To give you an example of a very interesting practical use of this, imagine if you were a spy. You could walk into a coffee shop and you could walk around and drink your coffee and stare at your coffee and look down completely. And this Neuralink inside of you would register everything that's going on. And then you could go home later and you could sit down and you could recall this memory and try to tune into the conversations that are around you and select certain parts of the conversation and amplify the noise amounts of them or something like this, and listen into what people were saying. You could go back and enhance parts of your experience that you barely even registered in the moment. Now, this is speculative, but I could see stuff like this happening. I don't know why we should assume it won't. I think our generation, us millennials, us zoomers, we're getting to that point now where we're sort of becoming spiritual boomers. We've kind of grown up through the iPhone era, and we just don't assume that anything new is going to come. And this new phenomenon, the Neuralink, will be a thing for the generation younger than us. Or maybe 2 generations. But nonetheless, it will happen. And all the kids will be doing it. And we'll all be walking around like idiot boomers saying that, like, what are they doing? This is a silly thing. What is going on? Until it takes over the whole world. And there's also a competitive side of this as well. An Ubermensch question. Because at what point do we see a singularity of power happen here? The first people to get the Neuralink and get it advanced enough, are they not going to become essentially a separate species of man with enhanced memory capacities, with the ability to interact with computers rapidly in the moment, with the ability to, memorize things and hear things that other people can't hear? They'll have like a 6th super sense. In some sense, this will be like Jung's man of the Aquarius, the age of the Aquarius, the men who take the Philosopher's Stone on board and plug these capacities into themselves and develop a new conscience. This will be the conscience of the future, the man and technology. This is an idea, by the way, that I'm going to have to expand on more because I've been thinking about it a lot. But think about the revolution in mind that has been taking place over the course of the last couple of ions. Like Nietzsche talking about the revolution in morals. We lived in prehistory where we didn't have a conscience, did we? We were savage primal beasts who lived at one with nature and allowed our instincts to explode out through us. We lived a very symbolic, instinctive life. We didn't really have this jaded Socratic or Ecclesiastes self-conception, overthinking. We didn't really have that moral consciousness. Then Zarathustra comes along and induces a conscience in us and tells us to move away from ritual and instinct towards the moral war within our minds. The Jews take this on board, and this eventually leads to Christianity, which makes its way into Rome and whooshes out the old instinctive pagan religion and induces into Europe this moral conscience. And we go through the ion of Christ, the ion of the morality, the ion of the wrestling with the mind. And in Nietzsche, we come across the first prophet to announce the end of this conscience. This 2,000 years of wrestling with the conscience has come to its conclusion. Zarathustra shows up once again to announce this. But the declaration is bizarre. Many people read it as returning back to ancient Rome or something like this, or the pagan ways. But what if it is a further progression in conscience? What if it means the next step for us is a further augmentation of our minds? We went from being instinctive to developing this institution we call the moral conscience. This is what Christ was aligning us with, as Jung pointed out in Ion. And now, entering into the age of Aquarius, the next Ion, the next era, our conscience becomes more advanced. It is the next step to our
I got
mind.
a headache.
Our conscience is technological. We're getting these implants put into our brains, and it's going to augment our brains and attach us to super intelligences. It's going to align us with artificial intelligence, and all of a sudden now we'll have this voice in our head that is not necessarily God, but it is Skynet, and the powers it gives us will move us beyond our old way that our brains worked. We'll have new institutions and new forces inside of ourselves. This will be the conscience of the future. And perhaps you're mad. You'll say, God fucking damn you, Steph. This is transhumanism. This is the Antichrist. Well, look, in fairness, it probably is. I'm not going to say no to what you're saying there. But this seems like there's inevitability to it. We've already started to adopt these phones. We've already started to plug ourselves into the computer. The most significant trend I see from the last 25 years is not anything more than the fact that mankind has been consumed by tech. That there was a sort of incapacity for us to resist the overwhelming power of technology, of these various hardware tools that have inserted themselves into our lives and absolutely revolutionized every aspect of our lives, down to our sexual relations, up to our conception of self and our culture itself. This incapacity to resist sort of reminds me of Christianity, the way Christianity just swarmed over Rome, swarmed over Europe, is because it was an idea whose time has come, as they'd say, for good or for bad. It seems like the moral doctrine of God, the God of the conscience, was what was necessary for a super civilization, the civilization that we exist in now. And so has technology taken this new place? Is technology displaying this overwhelming force for precisely the same reasons? It is too powerful. It's an era that we cannot resist. This is the time, the zeitgeist that we are in. And let's take a Nietzschean slant at this. Another very interesting idea about the future. Something about Nietzsche's Übermensch that people often don't mention is Nietzsche would look at slave morality as having a lot of value. He would say that slave morality gave us depth. The Jews becoming enslaved forced them to become psychological, which actually drove them to become creative and to create the moral prophecy that laid the foundation for Christianity. And the Christianization of Europe certainly maybe stole the Europeans' pagan powers from them. It took these blonde beasts of prey that lived up in northern Germany in the forests, and it stuck them inside monasteries where they hunched over, staring at Jewish fairy tales with their head in their hands, screaming, "Why am I so evil? What is wrong with me? Life is so terrible." Yes, it may have done this. They
were evil. They were being evil.
It have robbed us of our natural muscular beauty and vital power. And
No, it
indeed,
didn't.
maybe we need that back. But despite the fact that it stole this from us, it also gave us very powerful gifts.
And it's not fairy tales, it's
Nietzsche would
real.
often point out that only through the monasteries and the Christian university system and the united consciousness that came out of Christianity, almost like Christianity was this giant brain, this nervous system that spread out into Europe and connected all the European intellectual minds together, and this focus on the one God, the one truth, this monotheism that united all of our conscience towards this idea of reality and objective truth. It was only through all these forces that came together could we see the rise of science in the way that it did. And of course this science itself is what led to European supremacy over the whole world. And so without this quote-unquote slave morality, this morality of the conscience, this morality of self-doubt, we may not have gotten mastery over the planet as the Europeans achieved. We may not have gotten the blasting forward into the sciences that we saw happen. Another example of this, of course, is slavery. Christianity was hugely against slavery.
Oh!
Now, the aristocratic
We don't like
master
that.
morality would obviously support slavery. Slavery is naturally how things work, and Rome and Greece were built on slavery. The idea of a Roman aristocrat working was looked down upon. They didn't do that stuff. They got slaves to do this. Now, perhaps as a consequence of this, Rome failed to industrialize and become scientific because all these aristocrats would spend their time at war, seeking honor, seeking what they called dignitas, instead of tinkering with things and laboring and working and trying to figure out machines to help them take the burden of work off their back, because they had so many slaves to do their work. Now, of course, the Christian West was much different. There was much more of an ethos of work, of innovation, of creativity. And there was an ethos against slavery. The English banned slavery. The Spanish banned slavery long before that. These were some of the first civilizations in all of human history to do this. And so as a consequence of England banning slavery and being forced to do all their work themselves, well, what do you see happen? They build trains, they build machines, systems, factories, capitalism, the division of labor. And so it was through their refusal to engage in slavery because it's unchristian, because it's immoral, because it's bad for the conscience, it's against the conscience, that they gained the capacity to become industrial. And of course England sets off to conquer the entire known world. So there's an interesting relationship here between the compromise of what we might call slave morality or the conscience and the suppression of the instincts and the master urges. And history is full of a litany of examples of this. For example, the people who ended up ruling large parts of the Arab world, well, I guess you could say the Middle East after the Muslim conquests, were actually slaves. The Mamelukes, the Janissaries, these were people who were descended from slaves. The Muslim conquerors would steal slaves and use them as sex slaves, so basically women from, for example, Eastern Europe. And then their descendants would become very powerful. Towards the end, many of these states around Turkey and even places like Egypt, the upper class was almost entirely Slavic blood because they had this habit of constantly taking Slavic sex slaves. And the Janissaries were like this as well. Oftentimes the Janissaries were castrated and told to guard the sex harems of these Muslim conquerors, these Muslim masters. And many of these Janissaries would end up gaining positions of power because they'd be intimately involved in the court. They would be the slave guardians of the king. And then, for example, if the king died, they could actually lock down the state and stuff like this. So the world is very weird. You can be a slave and transform into a conqueror, into a master. The compromises of slavery, the restrictions, actually can give you power in interesting ways. And I say all this because there's a very weird possibility here where the disabled may become the Ubermensch.
What?
God damn, that statement's not going to do me any favors. But
yeah, I get what you're
this,
saying.
The people
because
who
they're the
will
people who will
embrace
get
Neuralink first
Neuralink.
are going to be people with defects, are going to be damaged people, people who had spinal injuries, people who may have had issues with mental problems or something like this. These are going to be the people that Neuralink will have to present itself to first, because that's what's going to look good. I don't think Musk is going to do very well if he says implant this into your brain so you can gain Iron Man powers over all of mankind, although maybe some billionaires would buy it for this reason. But in order to get passed by the FDA, you have to present it as something that heals the sick. You have to present it as a boon for mankind, how to help people who are paralyzed from the neck down. And so there's a possibility here that the most enslaved people, enslaved by the damage of biology itself, the tyranny of reality itself, may be some of the first people to gain these intellectual powers, to step into this new era of the Aquarian conscience. And God knows what they might achieve with this. Perhaps they will be the first to merge with artificial intelligence and develop a advanced IQ cyborg brain that is able to defeat all of our brains. Or if you want to think about it this way, imagine somebody who had a physical injury. You know, they lost their arm in a war or something like this, a defective, damaged person. And they go and they get this Neuralink so that they can create a bionic arm, because Neuralink is actually able to do this. It can reconnect your brain with robotic limbs. And so the first person to literally turn into a Terminator robot might be somebody who loses all their limbs in some far-off war, some veteran who says, to hell with it, give me the Iron Man arm. And this might become the first super warrior, the first invincible man. Replaces large parts of his body with technology. He becomes Darth Vader. And he gains this only because he's willing to make the sacrifice, only because of his wounds, of his slavery, of his disadvantage. Can he have the ability to transform into something never seen before? But I don't know. Perhaps it's a little bit of a nerd fantasy. Perhaps the only destiny we really have is a Ted Kaczynski collapse. Everything crumbles, and it's the rise of physical prowess once again. The future rulers will not be Jeff Bezos in an Iron Man suit floating above your bug city where you're forced to eat vegan sandwiches. No, it'll be the return of the noble Goths coming to cleanse Rome from its decadence. But I'll leave it up to you to make your judgments. What I can tell you is that while we're on this current trajectory, I would expect to see the further integration between man and technology. We are already bound to our phones. We are already developing consciousness that is married to the memetics that we consume. You'd be astounded about how much of your decisions and identity and worldview are fundamentally connected to where you get your media from. You don't have as much free will as you like to think. Think of this in the most simplest way possible. Take diet. I showed up to my parents' house one time and I told my dad that I was trying out veganism, and he froze. It was like a coming out moment of some sort, and he said, "Sit down." And I was like, "What?" And he went and he pulled out a big steak and he cooked me a steak and basically forced me to eat it.
Based dad?
No son of his was gonna, be a vegan. Now, of course, I was getting into veganism because it was a big thing at the time. I was very young and I wanted to try new things out. Now, of course, Dad's circles would have come from the 1980s, the time of real men, where real men ate burgers and ate barbecues. And the image that would have been projected into his mind by Hollywood, by media, the ideal of masculinity that he would have seen in his mind was the man who just grills, beer and barbecues. Yet in the last 5 years, I've gotten red-pilled on the diet question. I've come across Paul Saladino, Ray Peat, various other diet gurus, and have become very meat positive, let me put it this way. I even have my suspicions that there might be bad actors in this world trying to get us to stop eating meat. And interestingly, I've come home recently now to see my dad, and because the television is now telling him that meat is evil, it's causing the death of the climate, it's causing heart disease, it's causing
His dad's a yuppie.
all these terrible things. Now my dad is the one who is trying to avoid red meat. The media has changed both our minds. I find myself now arguing the opposite argument with him. I'm telling him to eat more red meat. He's telling me to eat more vegetables. Our relationship with media, with memes, is fundamental. Technology and consciousness are not as separate as we like to think. And Neuralink is just cutting out the middleman, which is the need to have all this stuff displayed on screens and various things like this. No, instead, we're going to go straight inside your brain and make all this happen faster, more intimately, and more intense. And within your mind, you may have had the voice of the conscience, the voice in your head that stands accountable to Jesus Christ. But now you will have a new voice. This Neuralink is going to have a living algorithm inside of it that talks back to you, that arranges things intelligently and presents them to you. This is going to be the beginning of a new type of man. So let's see how this plays out, my friends. And lastly, to end with some practical suggestions, your ability to adapt to this new scenario is what is going to determine your success. Say if you wanted to become a writer and you thought the best thing that you should do is go and write an old book. Deal with that old format of media, which nobody really reads, especially from new writers. You're making a grave mistake. It'd be much smarter for you to go and try to compartmentalize your ideas into social media posts or perhaps even TikTok videos so that you can present them in an intelligent way, adapted to our zeitgeist. And you'll find that the people who figure out how to adapt to the rapidly changing world of modern technology and modern media are the ones who get their ideas out there, the ones who make wealth from these new innovations, the ones who win instead of being victims to the times. And of course, this is what I work with people on in my storytelling programs. So if you're interested in learning how I adapt to the modern times and how I could teach you to make sure you're adapting correctly and getting the most out of these tools, I recommend you check those out. You can book a call down below and we'll take a look at your situation and how you could tackle this world for yourself.
My name is Troy Malcolm. I'm a urologist and physician at the Community Hospital of Anaconda. As urologists, we generally focus on the urinary system. Commonly that includes urinary tract infections or voiding dysfunction, but also can involve treatment of cancers. We strive for a thorough evaluation and also hopefully helping the patient understand their problems and give them a thorough treatment plan. The best part of my job is basically being able to help people out. I enjoy the interactions with the patients I get to meet and also helping improve people's lives.
Quite scandalous.
Oh my God!
Yes, I will.
Everybody get
I need a fire breather.
Hot mama.
Can you knock on the table for us?
Don't believe you.
Seriously.
Seriously, don't believe you.
Get me feeling good.
Oh, wow. You have our attention.
Donald Trump is a street fighter.
Donald Trump learned a crucial lesson as a child.
Do whatever you have to do. You say whatever you have to say. Winning is everything.
Donald Trump is a major deal maker, and he has made his money mainly from Manhattan real estate.
Trump, 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 Trump. His name is his power.
We realized what Americans really loved was celebrity. If you were a celebrity, everything was possible.
You're fired.
You're fired.
You're fired.
You're fired.
And if people mocked him,
Donald Trump is here tonight. He certainly would bring some change to the White House.
he should fight back.
I am officially running for President of the United States.
Here comes the war of the Trumps.
It was war, and they were determined to win it. You don't know what he's going to do next. You don't know what's going to happen to him next.
This isn't another video about Donald Trump's time as president. There are hundreds of those.
Over the... What is this? I kind of want to watch this. What's this guy's channel like, though?
Fall 1993. Executives from America's top defense contractors were invited to the Pentagon. The Cold War was over, and they were anxious.
Donald Trump is a street fighter.
Donald Trump learned a crucial lesson as a child.
Do whatever you have to do. You say whatever you have to say. Winning is everything.
Donald Trump is a major deal maker, and he has made his money mainly from Manhattan real estate.
Trump, 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 Trump. His name is his power.
We realized what Americans really loved was celebrity. If you were a celebrity, everything was possible. You're fired. You're fired.
You're fired.
And if people mocked him,
Donald Trump is here tonight. He certainly would bring some change to the White House.
he should fight back.
I am officially running for President of the United States.
Here comes the war of the Trumps.
It was war, and they were determined to win it. You don't know what he's going to do next. You don't know what's going to happen to him next.
This isn't another video about Donald Trump's time as president. There are hundreds of those.
Over the years, I've surprised a lot of people. The biggest surprise is yet to come.
This is the story of how Donald became Trump. Of all the men who've influenced Donald Trump, none have had a bigger influence than his father. Fred Trump was born in the Bronx to German immigrants Frederick and Elizabeth. After he finished high school, he took a job as a carpenter's assistant. He liked the work, but he wanted to be the boss. So when he turned 21, Fred incorporated a company, E. Trump and Son, named for his mother, who started the company before Fred was old enough to run it. During the Depression, Fred almost went out of business, but before he did, he got his big break. Fred built one of New York City's first modern self-serve supermarkets and sold it for a profit. He and his business partner used the profits to buy a subsidiary of a bankrupt real estate company for pennies on the dollar. That subsidiary gave them easy access to a bunch of properties that were nearing foreclosure. Fred bought them low, sold them high, and made enough money to turn E. Trump and Son into one of New York's biggest real estate companies. He passed his success on to his children. Donald and his siblings grew up in a house that had 23 rooms, and the family chauffeur drove them to school every morning. Fred also passed on his ruthless streak. Throughout Donald's childhood, his father always gave him the same advice: work hard, don't be weak, be a killer. Donald took it to heart. He bullied his classmates. He even bullied his younger brother. One day, he threw an eraser at his teacher. Fred immediately took action and sent Donald to a military boarding school upstate. It was a tough, competitive environment, but surprisingly for a rich kid, Donald thrived. He excelled at several sports and was named captain his senior year. In the yearbook, he was named Ladies' Man. Years later, Donald would credit his time at boarding school with teaching him the discipline he needed to succeed in business and politics. But he knew that discipline by itself wasn't enough. So he went to college, 2 years at Fordham University before a transfer to the University of Pennsylvania's business school. After graduating in 1968, Donald Trump joined his father's company. The first few years weren't glamorous. Donald and Fred had to roll up their sleeves and turn around some housing projects which were losing money. For Donald, it was an early lesson. Just because he'd been given lots of advantages, he still needed to work for his success. After a 3-year apprenticeship, Donald became president of the company. The torch had been passed from father to son. One of his first moves was to rebrand. E. Trump and Sons sounded stale and old-fashioned. A modern real estate business, led by a dynamic young entrepreneur, needed a glamorous name. So Trump rebranded it to the Trump Organization. It was an early step in the evolution from Donald to Trump. Trump moved into an Upper East Side apartment and started going to some of Manhattan's elite nightclubs, usually with a beautiful woman on his arm. It didn't look like it to most people, but Trump was working. He was marketing his most important commodity, himself. It was right around this time that he made his debut in another high-profile local institution, the New York Times. The Times embodied the elite establishment that, decades later, Trump would build a political career upon opposing. But in the early 1970s, he was anxious for their attention and approval. The first time the New York Times mentioned Donald Trump, it wasn't for a good reason. The headline said it all: "Major landlord accused of anti-black bias in city." The story concerned a Department of Justice lawsuit filed against Donald Trump and his father, which alleged that the Trump Organization discriminated against African Americans. Even for someone who believed all publicity was good publicity, it was tough reading. Most of the lawyers Trump talked to urged him to settle, but that just wasn't who he was. Trump met Roy Cohn at a swanky Manhattan nightclub in the early 1970s. Trump was complaining to anyone who'd listen that he couldn't find a lawyer who believed he could win the discrimination lawsuit. Cohn offered his services.
This fight, I have absolutely total confidence, is going to be won and won completely and totally.
He filed a $100 million countersuit against the Department of Justice. Although it was unsuccessful, the final settlement ultimately allowed the Trump Organization to get away without admitting any wrongdoing. It was a win for Trump, and a lesson he'd carry with him for the rest of his life. Never admit your mistakes. Roy Cohn was Donald Trump's lawyer for 15 years. The two men used each other. Cohn opened doors to the elite society that Trump secretly longed to be a part of, while Cohn found a rich young businessman he could influence.
This is a picture that hangs in my office directly alongside one of the President and Mrs. Reagan, two of my favorite people. And the picture is of Donald and me, in which he says, Roy is my greatest friend.
Trump soon set his sights on something that could make his career. The old Penn Central Railroad had gone broke a few years earlier and left behind 3 prime real estate assets, the Commodore Hotel and 2 rail yards on New York's west side. The rail yards were the largest undeveloped tracts of land left in Manhattan.
The Penn Central, which has been running in the red for a long time now, decided today to sell off some choice real estate, including 10 blocks in downtown Manhattan. They hope to bring in about $1 billion in the deal.
If Trump could get his hands on those assets, he'd prove to everyone, including his father, that he could succeed as a developer in his own right. He knew that if he played his cards right, he had a chance. He wined and dined the development agency's lead official. He held press conferences where he outlined his vision for the site. And thanks to his father's political connections, he met face-to-face with the mayor. After pulling strings for weeks, Trump got what he wanted, the right to develop the sites.
Closely and supports the renovation of the Commodore Hotel and reconstruction of the hotel on that site.
I'm not sure whether we're making the wisest decision in the world. I know that there is no other decision before us to make.
And the mayor feels that this is the best possible proposal that the city could get at this time.
Trump turned the Commodore into the Grand Hyatt.
Hyatt is a fantastic outfit, and all of this is going to combine to make probably the most successful hotel, one of them in the country, we feel.
The mayor and the governor of New York were among those on hand for the ribbon cutting.
He knew that just winning the development rights wasn't enough. It wasn't going to silence his critics, who said he was only in that position because of his father's money and connections. And it wasn't enough to satisfy his own ambitions. If he truly wanted to be the king of New York real estate, he had to build. And not just anything, something big. So Trump swung for the fences. He promised to build 20,000 apartments on the site, more than his father had built in his entire career.
All along from 72nd all the way down to 59th, we're going to have magnificent marinas, shopping, restaurants, everything all over the Hudson River.
The local community hated the idea. They thought the proposal just didn't fit with the character of the neighborhood, and they were politically influential enough to block the development. Trump raged. But there wasn't much he could do. Full-scale attack wouldn't work. The situation required deft diplomacy that Trump just didn't have in his toolkit. So when the option came up in 1979, he had no choice but to let it lapse. It was the biggest and most bitter disappointment of his career to date. But in Trump's mind, defeat was only ever temporary. So he made a vow that next time he wouldn't let it slip out of his grasp. In the meantime, he had other things occupying his mind. Ivana Marie Zelnikova was a tall, striking blonde with an exotic backstory. A competitive skier and child actor, she married a childhood friend so she could use his Austrian citizenship to escape the Eastern Bloc. After they divorced, she moved to Canada, where she met Trump. A few months after they started dating, they got married at a church on Fifth Avenue on April 9th, 1977. Their first son, Don Jr., was born about 9 months later.
Come on over, folks. Try and blow all the candles out with one breath, okay, honey? Make a wish. Make a big wish, and then when you're ready, blow the candles out, okay?
Fifth Avenue wasn't just home to the church where Donald Trump got married. He also wanted it to be the new headquarters of the Trump Organization. Trump had dreamed of building a tower on Fifth Avenue since he was a kid. To him, it represented the peak of glamour and power. The site he wanted was occupied by a luxury department store.
The finest piece of real estate in the world is at the corner of 5th Avenue and 57th Street. That's the Tiffany corner of the world.
In order to press his case, he kept calling and calling the parent company asking if they were interested in selling the site. They thought he was joking, but he was serious, and he wasn't going to give up. Finally, after a couple years, the parent company's new chairman, who was looking to pay down some debts, said yes.
The New York Times is reporting that Bonwitz is being sold to Donald Trump and that the store could be closed by July.
Trump secured the site, but that was only half the battle. He still had to persuade the approval committee, which was made up of the same sorts of people who'd blocked his plans for the rail yards just a couple years earlier. Trump needed a different approach. So this time, instead of aggression, he pointed to the fact that reputable architects liked his plan design. Not everyone was persuaded. The media class hated it.
The program has become a corporate welfare program.
I really think before you make those statements on the air that you should go back and check your facts and figures.
Donald, the statute says very specifically that in order to qualify, the site on which the residential building is going up is either vacant, predominantly vacant, or underutilized.
You don't think a 10-story building is an underutilization when I'm building a 68-story building?
Absolutely not.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Correct.
Okay. Tell me about it, Joe.
The construction of Trump Tower marked another big step in the journey from Donald to Trump.
Well, here we are on the top of the Trump Towers. Today is the topping off of this fabulous building.
This is the greatest skyline in the world, so this is a great addition to New York skyline.
8 years ago, I must say I was embarrassed to say I was in the real estate business in New York. Today, I can honestly say I'm proud of it, and it's the #1 city in the world.
What are your sentiments today regarding the whole celebration?
Very happy day. The completion of the tallest concrete building in the city of New York.
How are the sales going?
Well, I have nothing to do with sales, but I hear they're going excellent, fantastic, unbelievable.
And it marked the beginning of what would prove to be a highly successful decade.
Hello, welcome to the 80s.
Ronald Reagan, the next president of the United States.
Introducing Macintosh.
We have a new formula for Coke.
That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life.
Hi, Diana Francis. Take these for the Charles Foster George.
The murder of John Lennon, one of the most influential people of his time.
Gorbachev teared down this wall.
The 1980s were tailor-made for Donald Trump. Greed was good, and Ronald Reagan proved you didn't need to be a career politician to become president. Only in the 1980s could Trump go from being a real estate developer to a national celebrity who bridged the worlds of finance, entertainment, and politics.
Well, there's a lot of coverage in that.
The newspapers and magazines which had made fun of him were forced to cover his rise. He became a frequent guest on talk shows, whose hosts liked his charisma and his willingness to talk about all sorts of topics.
You are seen at all the right parties. You are on the covers of all the magazines. Do you cultivate a high profile?
No, I don't. For some reason, I mean, people call and they want to do something. If Newsweek calls and they say, Donald, we want to do a cover story, I guess you sort of have to go along with it. And that happened, and other things happen, and it's just something that happens, Jane. I can't really tell you why. Maybe you can tell me.
You are Mr. Make It Happen.
Well, it does
You
happen.
make things happen.
Well, that's good.
Ha! You're Mr. Make It Happen.
That's what I want to do.
Opening a casino added to Trump's opulent glamour. To many Americans, Trump, who had a tower with his name on it and a glamorous European wife, embodied the 1980s hyper-capitalist version of the American dream.
You'll walk down the street sometimes that people will touch you just for the good luck.
It's a strange phenomenon that's been taking place.
But even though he had almost everything anyone could ever want, there was still one thing Trump wanted, but didn't have: the West Side Rail Yard. After Trump was forced to give up the option half a decade earlier, it had been taken over by a friend of his father's, a man named Abe Hirschfield. Although the redevelopment plan was approved, Hirschfield couldn't finance the project. It was partly because he had made too many concessions to the local government. But mainly, it was because Donald Trump was working hard behind the scenes to make sure he didn't get the money he needed. When Hirschfield eventually walked away in frustration, Trump bought the development rights and a second chance to move out of his father's shadow once and for all. The week before Thanksgiving in 1985, he announced his plans. The site would house nearly 8,000 apartments and condos, and about 600 football fields worth of TV and movie studio space. Trump wanted to call it Television City.
Donald Trump would like NBC to move to this site on the west side of Manhattan. Why is it so important that NBC stay in New York?
Thousands of jobs, hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes, and perhaps almost as importantly, and maybe more importantly, NBC has a name, an image, a prestige that you really just don't get with another company.
Once again, the local community stood in his way. But Trump soon realized that his most formidable opponent wouldn't be local residents. It was the mayor. Ed Koch was Trump's mirror image. Each man wanted the same thing. They wanted New York City to be the greatest city in the world, and they wanted to be the main character. But they went about it in very different ways. Koch was a Democrat who described himself as a liberal with sanity. He despised the way Trump constantly tried to strong-arm the state into giving him tax breaks while turning the city into a playground for the ultra-rich. But he was growing increasingly dependent on the tax revenues that Trump and other rich developers brought in. Trump, meanwhile, hated anyone who stood in his way.
I hope that New York City has a different mayor at some point, because I think Ed Koch is a total disaster. He's been a very bad mayor for the city.
The positions that I take are not ideological. They are reasonable, they are sensible, and that's why people support me.
The two men had already fought a long battle over the tax status of Trump Tower.
Millionaire real estate developer Donald Trump will get a handsome tax break for his latest project on Fifth Avenue.
Television City was the next battlefront.
How have you the chutzpah to say
that
this government has been anti-development? That's an outrageous comment on your part, and I can prove that you're wrong.
Koch refused to give Trump the tax breaks he wanted.
I would say he's got no talent and only moderate intelligence.
And
If
only
I've
moderate
done anything,
intelligence.
I've gotten NBC focused on by the city of New York, and I think that's very important. I think it's vital.
Trump again found himself in the uncomfortable position of being powerless. He couldn't overcome the combined resistance of Ed Koch and the community activists. The dream of Television City was dead, and the rail yard site remained frustratingly out of reach, at least for now. Trump turned his frustration into speculation. He bought a fleet of planes from a bankrupt airline and started his own airline, Trump Shuttle.
I never thought I'd be doing this, I have to tell you. So just everybody have a good time, and for many years enjoy the Trump Shuttle.
He plowed money into expanding his casinos in Atlantic City. But in hindsight, the most important thing he did was release a book. The Art of the Deal was about Trump's life, career, and business strategy. It was a big success.
Trump, The Art of the Deal. You're a star, Mr. Trump, and you're a businessman.
If I can help people to make deals, that's great. But if I can help people not to make deals that shouldn't be doing it, maybe that's just as good.
Every time I come onto your show, I sell a lot of books, so I don't know exactly.
We're making you famous.
You're making me famous?
And it was his gateway to what would become his future career.
If you lost your fortune today, what would you do tomorrow?
Maybe I'd run for president.
30 years before he ran for president, Donald Trump was talking about the same issues.
The United States is systematically being ripped off by many of the wealthiest countries of the world.
The fact is that the world is ripping off this country. Germany is ripping us off big league. Saudi Arabia is ripping us off big league. Everybody's taking advantage of the United States. We're defending Japan. And the Japanese folks, who I respect greatly, but they're not treating us fairly.
They think we are the biggest fools, the dumbest people in the world.
Trump didn't just talk about politics on TV. He spent nearly $100,000 on a full-page ad where he criticized U.S. foreign policy.
I find those ads ridiculous. He spent $100,000 for self-advertisements. Who's really interested in his foreign policy? Anybody? Maybe Mrs. Trump.
What's that guy's name?
Trump's politics were shaped by his fear of weakness and by the zero-sum environment of Manhattan real estate.
That's why the country is losing billions and hundreds of billions of dollars today because of a mistake in the tax law. We're going to have a war through weakness because this country is acting so weak toward Iran, it's pathetic.
In real estate, at least the kind of real estate that excited Trump, there was no such thing as a permanent ally or a win-win situation. Everything was temporary and transactional. Foreign affairs worked differently. After the success of The Art of the Deal and the positive reaction from some quarters to his political statements, Trump realized the public wanted to hear what he had to say, even about issues outside his wheelhouse.
You have said that if you ran for president, you'd win.
I think I'd have a very good chance. I mean, I like to win. When I do something, I like to win. I like to do well, and I think I probably would have a pretty good chance.
Trump enjoyed moonlighting as a political commentator.
Well, I'm a proud American. I mean, I have a great feeling for this country, Larry. I love this country. I think it's a great country.
But events would soon drag him back to his core business. A pair of Forbes journalists were sent a leaked copy of a financial disclosure statement that Trump had to file with New Jersey's Casino Control Commission.
In November 1988, Donald Trump purchased the Taj Mahal project, and here we are today, requesting this commission issue a casino license and operation certificate to Donald J. Trump's Taj Mahal.
The report revealed something which no amount of bluffing could hide. Donald Trump was drowning in debt. He fought hard to keep the story from being published, but it went to print with just one last-minute edit. His net worth was bumped up from 0 to $500 million. By now, being seen as rich and successful was an important part of Trump's business strategy. So the accusation that he wasn't actually as rich as he claimed to be was a big blow, especially when it was made by a media that was itching to bring him down a peg.
You became very public very clearly by your own design.
I don't know if it was by my own design.
You mean the publicity?
I do developments which get a lot of publicity. I mean, if I didn't do Trump, I mean this. I mean, there's no reason to expose yourself to millions of people.
But you know why you do it?
Why?
You love the publicity.
Oh, I hate the publicity.
Oh, come on, get out of here.
I'm telling you, I hate the publicity.
Oh, please.
I hate it.
The revelation that Trump and his businesses were struggling financially marked the end of peak Trump and the beginning of the hardest period of his entire career. If the 1980s were the boom, then the 1990s were the crash.
In what could be his final roll of the dice, the Donald met late into the night with creditors who want to shut down his Taj Mahal casino and get their money back.
So what happened? It was a combination of both the micro and the macro. The micro was, well, that he was Donald Trump.
He bought Mar-a-Lago, a 118-room mansion in Palm Beach.
He bought the venerable Eastern Shuttle. Of course, he named it Trump. The price, $365 million cash.
I wonder what he's going to buy next. I don't know.
The most publicity he has ever gotten, however, was from his sudden decision to buy a football team.
He didn't pursue what you'd call a disciplined personal investment strategy. Instead, he leveraged against what was becoming his biggest asset, his personal brand. But brands can lose their appeal. The macro was slightly more complicated. When Trump began his career, New York City was experiencing a major economic and social crisis. He took advantage of historically low property prices and, frankly, a government that was desperate for extra revenue. When the economy rebounded, his fortune grew rapidly. His entry into the casino business followed a similar pattern. He got in soon after New Jersey legitimized casino gambling. Most of Trump's acquisitions were funded by debt, and that wasn't necessarily a problem, so long as the economy stayed strong. But that's not what happened. Right at the beginning of the 1990s, the US economy slipped into recession.
For the third straight day, a selling avalanche hit Wall Street.
Well, the Dow Jones index had gone down by over 100 points.
Trump's businesses were all dependent on high levels of consumer spending. When the economy slowed down, they stopped spending money, and Trump started hemorrhaging cash. At one point, Trump was more than $3 billion in debt.
Trump is going down to the wire with his empire in danger of toppling. He has to come up with millions of dollars by tomorrow, or an uncontrollable chain of events could be set in motion.
In exchange for an emergency loan that kept the Trump organization afloat, Trump had to sell his yacht, airline, and part of the Grand Hyatt, one of his first ever real estate projects. His 3 casinos declared bankruptcy. He was even put on an allowance. Trump's high-profile problems weren't limited to his career either. His marriage was collapsing. Trump had started an affair with an aspiring actress, Marla Maples. The affair was splashed across tabloid headlines, in full view of the public, Ivana, and the couple's 3 children, Don Jr., Eric, and Ivanka.
Over her dead body. Give me the plaza. Best sex I've ever had. This is the best one. Ivana, better deal.
When they divorced in 1991, Ivana got $14 million, the 45-room Connecticut mansion, and an apartment in Trump Plaza.
I believe that if a man leaves a woman for almost any reason, that particular person, the man, is going to be at a major disadvantage in terms of the public eye. There's no question about it.
Trump's critics greeted his downfall with Schadenfreude. To To them, his problems proved that the image he portrayed of being a self-made man who won by taking bigger risks than anyone else was fake. Instead, he only got to where he was because he received the sort of help other people didn't have access to. Generous tax breaks from the government and millions of dollars worth of gifts and low-interest loans from his father. Trump took big risks because he knew he had a safety net. And it was those risky, high-profile investments that had created the Trump legend. Just when it looked like Trump had hit rock bottom, he was forced to finally admit defeat on the project he'd been chasing for years, the West Side Rail Yards. The community activists he'd fought for so long drew strength from Trump's struggles. They developed their own plans for the 76-acre lot. Once he'd accepted the proposal brought by the local activists, all the political opposition he'd been facing suddenly melted away. He eventually sold the development rights to a consortium of businessmen from Hong Kong. It saved him from the ultimate indignity, filing for personal bankruptcy. And it marked the beginning of one of the most famous and controversial comebacks in history. The turmoil that destroyed Donald Trump's marriage and almost destroyed his career was a major inflection point in his life. From now on, he wasn't going to be the biggest developer in New York City. He had to become something else. But if Trump was going to reinvent himself, first he needed a comeback. Comebacks are a key part of Trump's psychology. They're his way of telling himself and the whole world that even though it looked like he might be losing, he actually just wasn't winning yet. And comebacks are the transition from the about-to-be winning state to the winning state. The other thing to know about a Trump comeback is that the facts come second to the story. That's not to say the comeback wasn't real. It was. Trump made a good deal when he sold the development rights to the West Side Rail Yard site. Taking the Trump Plaza Casino public on the New York Stock Exchange helped him solve his immediate cash flow problems. And convincing the banks that they didn't want to get involved in the casino business took a lot of courage and instinct. All up, Trump went from a net worth of negative $900 million to positive $700 million in 5 years. But he was never content to let the numbers speak for themselves. In word and deed, he told America that he was back. He started splashing out on high-profile assets like the Miss Universe, Miss USA, and Miss Teen USA pageants.
I'm Donald Trump, and this is the most important pageant in the world. And I should know, because I own it.
As well as a 70-story office building at 40 Wall Street, which he renamed the Trump Building. He released The Art of the Comeback, a book-length announcement that he was back, and that he remembered the names of everyone who deserted him in tough times.
The business book is how to come back from adversity, how to handle adversity, and I think it's something that really people want to read, as you can see by what you're seeing right now.
Telling everyone that he was back generated business opportunities, positive media stories, and a sense of momentum that was impossible to resist.
Mr. Trump here wrote The Art of the Deal. Then he wrote a new bestseller, The Art of the Comeback. 2 books. Wow.
It was genius, and it taught Trump a lesson. People love a comeback story. He filed it away for future reference.
Over the years, I've surprised a lot of people. The biggest surprise is yet to come.
Now that he had a comeback story to sell, Trump became curious about another potential run for the presidency. A political consultant he'd started working with by the name of Roger Stone commissioned some polling. More than 3/4 of respondents said they'd never vote for him. But despite that, there was good raw material to work with. He was one of the most famous people in America. Just 17% of respondents, basically 1 in 6, had no opinion about Trump. And people loved his story. They saw a successful businessman who embodied the American dream. They saw him as someone who got things done.
I sort of love and hate him at the same time. I mean, I think he has, a monumental ego.
He comes off as being very, what's the word I'm looking for?
Arrogant?
Yeah, he's arrogant.
I like him.
You do?
Man's got it made, got everything.
Perhaps the most interesting result was that more people, about 1/4 of all respondents, saw Trump as liberal, more than the share of people that saw him as a conservative. Trump's political identity had long been a mystery, perhaps even to himself.
Because he was
a rich
liberal
guy at a time when being rich almost automatically meant being Republican. But his social life, the parties, the girlfriends, the tabloid stories made him seem more like a Democrat. Remember, this was a time when the Democratic president happened to be a well-known womanizer.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
The results bolstered Trump's belief that if he put his mind to it, he could be president.
They say a job like president requires a big ego. Now, do you think you can handle it?
I'm not sure my ego is big enough. That's one of the things which I can...
Really? Can I write that down?
You can write it.
But before he could make any decisions about what to do next, tragedy struck. In June of 1999, his father, Fred Trump, died. He'd been suffering from dementia for years, and when he contracted pneumonia, he couldn't fight it off. Privately, Donald was heartbroken, but publicly, he used the occasion to reminisce about his favorite subject, himself. He began his eulogy to his father by saying that it was the toughest day of his own life. It was ironic, he said, to have learned of his death right after reading a New York Times story, front page, about one of his own successful developments. Marla Maples didn't attend Fred Trump's funeral. Her and Donald had divorced 17 days before his death. Instead, Trump was accompanied by Melania Naus, a Slovenian model who he'd been dating since the previous year.
Did you like him right away?
It was a great chemistry and energy. We had, great time. We started to talk, and, it was something was there right away.
After the funeral and a drawn-out fight over his father's will, Trump turned his focus back to the question he'd been mulling over since before his father's death. Should he run for president? This time, he'd come closer than ever before, but it wouldn't be as a Republican or a Democrat.
The
Instead,
Green Party.
He almost ran for the party that, out of nowhere, had emerged as a real force in American politics. Before Donald Trump, there was another successful businessman who'd made a massive impact on U.S. politics. His name was Ross Perot. The founder of a successful data company, Perot ran for president in 1992 and 1996.
Do you want a government that comes at you from Washington, or do you want a government that comes from you? Okay. Who do the people in Washington work for? Who pays their salaries? I want to be your president.
Although he didn't win a single electoral vote either time, he introduced Americans to a new kind of politics. His views didn't fit neatly into either the Republican or Democrat columns. He was skeptical about free trade at a time when both major parties supported it. And he supported a balanced federal budget while also wanting to raise taxes on the wealthy. Lots of people, especially those who didn't support him, called Perot a populist. Whatever he was, he struck a chord with voters. Perot won almost 18% of the popular vote running as an independent in the 1992 election, the highest share won by a third-party candidate for 80 years. 4 years later, he won 8% of the vote as the Reform Party candidate. From his penthouse, Donald Trump was watching closely. A successful CEO with experience running a big company had just shaken up American politics. Perot demonstrated that there were votes in challenging the consensus on mainstream issues like free trade. And besides, Trump had way more name recognition. If he ran, why couldn't he win? Acting on the advice of his friend Jesse Ventura, a former professional wrestler who'd been elected governor of Minnesota, Trump joined the Reform Party. He formed an exploratory committee, went on talk shows, took a high-profile campaign swing to California, and vowed to spend $100 million to win not just the Reform Party nomination, but the presidency. He rushed out a book outlining his policy proposals. He even talked about having Oprah as his running mate. Trump won the Reform Party's California primary. It looked like he'd win the entire nomination. He could have been up on stage with George W. Bush and Al Gore, two guys who weren't exactly known for their charisma. And then, just as quickly as he entered the race, Trump dropped out.
I'm not going to be running. The party is, as you know, self-destructing.
The Reform Party was being consumed by infighting. Trump believed it wasn't in a position to give him the support he needed. But that was a smokescreen. Even after the Reform Party collapsed, he could have just run as a self-funded independent. Trump didn't run in 2000 because he knew that if he ran and didn't win, he'd look like a loser. That was his biggest nightmare.
I would run if I thought I could win, and in order to win...
Not only the nomination, but the presidency.
The whole thing. I don't want to get 20% of the vote, and I think I could, and I know I could get the nomination. But I always said, and I said to you, if I could win the whole thing, you can only win the whole thing with a totally unified party.
But Trump didn't close the door on a future run. When asked by a reporter if he'd consider running again, for real, he said he'd consider it in a few years.
It's a real possibility.
We're back to the flirtation here.
Well, I always flirt.
Six months after the 9/11 terror attacks, a man named Mark Burnett came to see Donald Trump with an idea. He'd just finished producing a popular primetime TV show called Survivor, and he wanted to remake it. Only this time, instead of being set in the jungle, it would be set in the boardroom. And he was wondering if Donald Trump would be interested in being one of the hosts. Trump thought it over for a while before agreeing. A couple of years later, the debut episode of The Apprentice went to air.
New
I
York,
remember The
my
Apprentice.
city,
The Apprentice was so
where the
sick.
wheels of the global economy never stop turning.
More than 20 million people tuned in on average every week to see contestants face off in various business-related challenges. But the real star was Donald Trump. NBC quickly shelved plans to have rotating hosts and built the entire show around him. In the intro to the very first episode, Trump invoked his comeback of a few years earlier.
I was seriously in trouble. I was billions of dollars in debt. But I fought back and I
billions of
won.
dollars in
Big
debt.
league. And as the master, I want to pass along my knowledge to somebody else. I'm looking for The Apprentice.
The Apprentice was one of the best things that ever happened to him. Over the 14 seasons he was host, Trump made close to $500 million from his salary, licensing, and other residuals. And it did wonders for his reputation. By the 2000s, real estate had been overtaken in the cool stakes by industries like tech. Trump, by virtue of his personality, was partly immune to that effect. But by beaming him into millions of homes every week, Trump was also reminding people that he was a successful businessman with a lifestyle worth emulating.
We grew up with The Apprentice. I mean, I remember watching that TV show. Like, that's when he had me, because, you know, I'm trying to be CEO one day.
The Apprentice was a major step in the transformation of Trump, from being primarily a real estate developer to being someone whose main business was selling his own name.
You seize opportunity. You get a hit TV show, and the show wasn't even on that long, and you're thinking fragrance, board game, books, suits, and you get all that out there. I've been on the air for 11, coming up on 12 years, not one product.
Most of these products failed, some after a few years, others almost immediately. But that was almost beside the point. They were all possible because of the success of The Apprentice. It was 2009, and Trump was about to release his latest book, Think Like a Champion. The U.S. was facing major upheaval on two fronts. The collapse of the investment bank Lehman Brothers triggered a wholesale financial meltdown and recession. And just months after, the country elected its first ever non-white president. The combination of those two seismic events was fundamentally altering the country's politics. For Donald Trump, who by now was a Republican again, this transformation looked like bad news. In 2010, he was introduced to the director of a documentary about the financial crisis. His name was Steve Bannon. Bannon was a microcosm of the evolution of conservative politics. He'd been an investment banker for Goldman Sachs. From there, he pivoted into media, where he ended up becoming the executive chairman of Breitbart News, a bomb-throwing right-wing news organization. At Trump's luxury penthouse apartment atop the tower that bore his name, the two men talked about how China was ripping off the United States. It was just like Trump's old diatribes against Japan, updated for a new age and a new rival.
In the United States, a majority of Americans say the country is on the wrong track, and no segment of the electorate is more frustrated with the U.S. government and President Barack Obama than the folks driving the Tea Party movement.
The Tea Party is hard to define because it doesn't want to be. It's anti-big government.
Bro, the Tea Party was based as fuck.
Obama. But after that, the lines blur.
The Tea Party movement was partly inspired by a backlash to Barack Obama, but it was also an eruption of anger about issues that had been bubbling up under the surface for years: federal bailouts, corporate welfare, and government overreach. Dozens of Tea Party activists ran against establishment Republicans in primaries, and some even went on to become senators and members of Congress. Despite the massive amounts of energy generated by the Tea Party movement and major gains in the 2010 midterms, Republicans didn't have a candidate who could channel that energy. Lots of Republicans wanted to vote for someone who wasn't afraid to throw a punch, someone they knew and liked, and someone who wasn't afraid to say some pretty outrageous things. Who would be their champion?
Just 'cause we are the champions of the world.
We're gonna win so big. Thank you very much.
We're gonna win so big.
In early 2011, Trump spoke at CPAC, a high-profile Republican conference. He walked out to the ABBA song Money, 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 called Republican candidates losers, quoted a magazine story about what a great entrepreneur he was, and promised to repeal Obamacare. It was classic Trump. What was new, at least for him, was his claim that Obama came out of nowhere.
Our current president came out of nowhere. Came out of nowhere. In fact, I'll go a step further. The people that went to school with him, they don't even know, they never saw him. They don't know who he is. Crazy.
If the audience didn't take the bait, he'd probably have dropped it, but they bit.
Nobody knew who the hell he was. He's now our president. He's our president.
Trump gave the most popular speech of the entire conference. Asking questions about where Obama was born was a strategy modeled directly on his campaign against the Central Park Five more than 20 years earlier. Trump happily exploited people's racial biases because doing so helped generate publicity.
I want him to show his birth certificate. There's something on that birth certificate that he doesn't like.
Oh my God, that is just the worst thing. That he was 3 pounds today.
I love you. I'm telling
I love you too. I think that's the biggest pile of dog mess I've heard in ages.
Thanks mainly to the birther claims, Trump surged to the top of early polls for the 2012 Republican presidential nomination.
You have people now down there searching, in Hawaii?
Absolutely, and they cannot believe what they're finding.
Well, I've been told very recently, Anderson, that the birth certificate is missing. I've been told that it's not there and it doesn't exist.
What have they found? Well, it's none of your business right now. We're going to see what happens. Have they found anything? We're going to see what happens.
In a crowded field full of eccentric candidates, Trump applied the skills he'd learned from years in the bare-knuckle world of Manhattan real estate. Eventually, Obama was forced to produce his long-form birth certificate.
And just to be clear, I know where my birth certificate is, but a lot of people don't.
A few weeks later, he got his revenge when he roasted Trump at the White House Correspondents' Dinner.
But it wasn't a roast, because Trump did become president, so...
...is prouder to put this birth certificate matter to rest than the Donald. And that's because he can finally get back to focusing on the issues that matter. Like, did we fake the moon landing? And where are Biggie and Tupac?
Trump responded to the humiliation by pulling out of the race. In the end, despite the excitement created by candidates who were on board with the Tea Party's agenda, the Republican nomination was won by Mitt Romney, a polite Mormon who'd founded a private equity firm. But Romney couldn't inspire enough Republicans to vote for him in the general election. Everyone expected Trump's interest in politics to fade, and for him to move on to other interests. If anything, his interest deepened. To people who made a career out of following Trump, it actually wasn't a surprise. Trump had a short attention span for things he didn't really care about. But when it came to things he did care about, like the West Side rail yards, he could be very determined. During this time, America was changing. News had become more and more polarized, and a spate of alternative news sources had begun popping up, such as Breitbart News. Trump took notice of the void that these organizations were filling and had begun really pushing the same narratives on his now blossoming Twitter account.
You know how many people on Twitter every day ask me to run for president? Please, Mr. Trump, run for president. Please, Mr. Trump, you're the only one who can save the country.
Large swaths of the country were becoming red-pilled, and so was the Republican Party. Republicans won big in the 2014 midterms, winning the Senate and expanding their majority in the House. And
was that a term back then?
Security and the threat from countries like China. Pollsters couldn't remember the last time so many candidates won despite having net negative approval ratings. Trump had always believed he could become president, but he'd never had the support from a major party he needed to actually win. Suddenly, the stars were aligning. Americans, especially Republicans, were willing to listen to increasingly radical solutions to the problems they faced. But no one on either side of the political aisle had Trump's charisma or name recognition. If he could put it together, it could be a potent combination. On June 16, 2015, Donald Trump descended down an escalator at Trump Tower, with his wife Melania by his side and Neil Young's Rockin' in the Free World playing and Change the World.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am officially running for President of the United States, and we are going to make our country great again.
He opened his speech by lamenting that the United States didn't have victories anymore. The country had become a dumping ground for everyone's problems. Billions of dollars had been spent on overseas wars with nothing to show for it except dead and maimed soldiers. The economy was weak and being made weaker by Obamacare and trade deals that were offshoring jobs to places like China and Mexico. And Republicans weren't serious about tackling the problems facing the nation. Trump's candidacy was a comeback narrative. He engineered one of the most famous comebacks in history. He could do the same for his country. The mainstream media, which had never really taken him seriously, treated Trump's speech largely as a joke.
Do it. Do it. Look at me. Do it. I will personally write you a campaign check now.
Trump's running for president. Like, this is your worst nightmare.
People think that Donald Trump is a clown.
Does anybody seriously think that Donald Trump is serious about running for president?
But his campaign wasn't a joke. In fact, Trump had been planning it for months. He'd hired a staff and kept guys like Stone and Bannon close. Contrary to the public perception of Trump as scattered, they maintained a laser-like focus on issues where they knew that Trump's views resonated with voters, like trade and immigration. A few months before Trump went down the escalator, his advisors suggested that he start talking about a physical wall on the US border with Mexico. They actually intended it mostly as a metaphor that would remind him to talk about immigration, but Trump took it literally.
Please welcome Donald Trump. Thank you so much. I saw the other day on television people just walking across the border. They're walking. The military standing there holding guns, and people just walking right in front, coming into our country. We have to build a fence, and it's got to be a beauty. Who can build better than Trump? I build. That's what I do.
And his instincts were correct. The wall became one of the most enduring images of his entire presidential campaign, and it ensured that Trump was always taken seriously on immigration. The mainstream media might have treated Trump as a joke, but Republican leaders didn't. Trump was their worst nightmare. Remember, they wanted to extend an olive branch to minority voters. Meanwhile, Trump was on stage talking about how Mexican immigrants were rapists. But establishment Republicans would soon learn that they couldn't do anything to stop him. The 2016 Republican primaries became the Trump show.
You've called women you don't like fat pigs, dogs, slobs, and disgusting animals. Your Twitter account
Only Rosie O'Donnell.
He turned politics into must-watch TV, and voters loved it.
He hit my hands. Nobody has ever hit my hands. I've never heard of this one. Look at those hands. Are they small hands? And he referred to my hands. If they're small, something else must be small. I guarantee you there's no problem. I guarantee.
Trump quickly rose to the top of the polls. In private, he didn't think he'd stay there, but his campaign just kept gathering momentum, and events overseas ensured it would stay there.
Is he gonna kill him now?
On December 12th, 2015, a Muslim couple killed 14 people at a work Christmas party. Trump, who'd made headlines the previous month after terrorists killed 130 people in attacks in Paris, quickly called for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. It was a significant escalation of his anti-Muslim rhetoric in the campaign. Trump's opponents latched on to the remark. Finally, they thought, we can nail him. But they couldn't land a blow. Trump said something which should have, by the usual rules of presidential politics, made him lose support. But instead, he would gain support. Voters didn't care about convention. Instead, they rewarded him for talking about issues in a way they perceived as true. Trump himself recognized that he was wearing plot armor and could get away with saying some pretty crazy things.
My people are so smart. And you know what else they say about my people? The polls. They say, I have the most loyal people. Did you ever see that? Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay? It's like incredible.
2 months after the shooting in San Bernardino, Trump's name appeared on a ballot for the first time as an active candidate at the Iowa caucuses, which marked the start of voting in the Republican primaries. Despite leading in the polls, Trump actually finished second in Iowa behind Ted Cruz. Lots of people, including most of the mainstream media, breathed a sigh of relief. Surely they thought the madness was about to end. The adults were about to take over, but Trump was just getting started. He won in New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina, a state where more than a quarter of people were African American. Soon, Trump's opponents were forced to admit something. To have any chance of stopping him from winning the nomination, they had to work together. The field was soon whittled down to just 3 candidates: Trump, Cruz, and Ohio Governor John Kasich. People who were desperate to see Trump fail thought he might stumble under the pressure of being closer to the finish line, especially as questions began being asked about his tax returns. Before 2016, it was customary for serious candidates to release their tax returns as part of the public vetting process.
I'm not releasing the tax returns because, as you know, they're under audit. You know, the only one that cares about my tax returns are the reporters.
But Trump simply chose to play by a different set of rules. He knew his tax returns would be full of compromising details like big debts and business dealings in places like Russia. So instead of releasing them, he concocted an excuse about how he wasn't legally allowed to because he was being audited by the IRS. It was yet another example of how he was able to run rings around both his opponents and a critical media. As the Republican convention, the event where a nominee would be formally selected, approached, Trump had a huge lead in the delegate count. He won 41 of the 56 primary contests. It looked like a formality. Ted Cruz made a last-ditch attempt to get delegates to change their mind. But just like every other attempt Republicans made to stop Trump, it failed.
I humbly and gratefully accept your nomination for the presidency of the United States.
Something which for years had seemed totally impossible had, in truth, been inevitable for months. Donald Trump had concocted a hostile takeover of the Republican Party and made it look easy. He'd done it by tapping into a well of genuine grievances about American society and the economy, and having the charisma to say what other people weren't willing to. And now, almost 30 years after he first flirted with the idea of running, he was the nominee of a major party, set to run against a highly experienced and well-known opponent, Hillary Clinton. You couldn't imagine 2 more different people. Trump was the brash real estate developer from Jamaica Estates who bulldozed his way into the national consciousness through sheer force of will. Clinton was the Secretary of State and former First Lady who'd been preparing to run for president since she was in college. Serious people expected Clinton to win pretty easily in November. The establishment wanted her to win, but it wouldn't be so simple.
Clinton's campaign found itself fighting allegations and answering for thousands of private emails sent to and from its chair, John Podesta, that were hacked and published by WikiLeaks.
And the Clinton campaign knows this could be a problem for them every day until Election Day.
In the leaked emails, leading Democrats talked about how to undermine Bernie Sanders. The DNC hack could not have come at a better time for Republicans. They'd been trying to make the Democrats' sloppy information security an election issue ever since the FBI opened an investigation into Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server while she was Secretary of State. The leaks gave them an opening to attack Clinton for her personal ethics, and they looked like great fodder for Trump.
Her criminal action was willful, deliberate, intentional, and purposeful. Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. I think you will probably be rewarded mightily by our press.
But despite first appearances, the leaked emails weren't all good news for Trump. In fact, they brought up an issue that he'd been trying desperately to avoid. Why did Donald Trump seem to like Vladimir Putin so much? The relationship between the two men dated back to at least 2013, when Trump wrote a tweet asking if Putin would attend the Miss Universe pageant in Moscow and whether he'd become his new best friend. That was weird, but at the time, no one really paid much attention. But since then, Putin had sent Russian troops to annex Crimea and destabilize the democratically elected government in Ukraine, a US ally. And long before then, his disregard for the rule of law had turned him into one of the United States' main geopolitical adversaries.
Based on the executive order that I signed in response to Russia's initial intervention in Ukraine, we're imposing sanctions on more senior officials of the Russian government.
Trump seemed to genuinely like Putin and admire his strongman political style.
Putin has done an amazing job of showing certain leadership that our people have not been able to match.
But people also wondered if there was something deeper. Did Trump have business interests in the country?
We're thinking about doing a Trump Tower in Moscow, so we're talking to a group of people about doing that.
Did the Russians have compromising material on him?
Donald, do you have a relationship with Vladimir Putin?
I do have a relationship, and I can tell you that he's very interested in what we're doing here today. He's probably very interested in what you and I are saying today.
And why was Trump acting so weird about it?
What exactly is your relationship with Vladimir Putin? I have no relationship with Putin.
I have no relationship with him. But if you have no relationship with Putin, then why did you say in 2013, I do have a relationship? In 2014, I spoke...
Because he has said nice things about me over the years. I remember years ago, he said something, many years ago, he said something very nice about me.
Trump's reluctance to criticize Putin cut against a core part of his pitch to American voters, that he would use the negotiation skills he'd honed over a long business career to stop the US from being ripped off by other countries. But he saw things a different way. If Russia was willing to interfere in the US election on his behalf, why should he stop them? Besides, Trump was confident that after 40 years in the spotlight, Americans knew who he was, for better or worse. As the campaign neared its conclusion, Clinton had established a small but clear polling lead. If it held up on election night, she'd become the country's first female president. But there were still 2 more surprises in store. A month before the election, the Washington Post published a video of a conversation Trump had had with the host of a TV show called Access Hollywood, where he'd made degrading remarks about women.
Yeah, that's it, with a girl. I gotta use some Tic Tacs just in case I start kissing her. Yeah, automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. Just I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the I can do anything.
The tape was large caliber ammunition for Trump's critics. It showed he was crude, misogynistic, and not fit for the office he was seeking. Trump knew it was bad, because for the first time in his campaign, and maybe for one of the first times in his adult life, he apologized.
I've never said I'm a perfect person, nor pretended to be someone that I'm not. I've said and done things I regret, and the words released today on this more than a decade-old video are one of them.
The campaign briefly went into lockdown. Some people even told Trump to drop out, but he had no intention of doing anything like that. Instead, he used the time to plan his counterattack.
I've said some foolish things, but there's a big difference between the words and actions of other people. Bill Clinton has actually abused women, and Hillary has bullied, attacked, shamed, and intimidated his victims.
Donald Trump's decision to appear before the second presidential debate with the women who accused Bill Clinton of sexual assault was a move straight from the playbook of New York real estate. Instead of groveling or pulling out of the race, he went on the offensive. It was a reminder that Trump was willing to do whatever it took to win, and that despite his own flaws, his opponents weren't spotless either.
Mr. Trump may have said some bad words, but Bill Clinton raped me and Hillary Clinton threatened me. I don't think there's any comparison.
The tactic worked. Instead of the Access Hollywood tape, people started talking about Trump's audacity and Bill Clinton's past.
Okay, thank you all very much. We appreciate it.
Mr. Trump, you touch women without their consent. Mr. Trump, why did you say you touch women without consent, Mr. Trump?
Why don't y'all ask Bill Clinton that? Why don't y'all go ask Bill Clinton that? Go ahead and ask Hillary as well.
The Access Hollywood experience hardened Trump's belief that he would be rewarded by his supporters for standing up to what they saw as the politically correct establishment. If the mainstream media and Democrats and even some Republicans wanted him to drop out, that was like a badge of honor he was happy to wear. But an eventful campaign still had one twist left.
The FBI reopening the investigation into Hillary Clinton's email use. Director James Comey explaining in a letter to Congress, in connection with an unrelated case, the FBI has learned of the existence of emails that appear to be pertinent to the investigation.
James Comey's decision to reopen the investigation into Hillary Clinton's email server was a shocking last-minute surprise. Still, it looked like it was too little too late. On election night, Trump wasn't expecting to win. He enjoyed how close he'd come and enjoyed a campaign which had been built around indulging him. He settled in for the night at his Trump Tower penthouse. Clinton, meanwhile, had booked out the Javits Center, a convention center with a glass ceiling she thought she'd be breaking through, which just happened to be built on a site which Donald Trump used to own back in the 1970s. And then, over the course of the night and into the early hours of the morning, history was made.
Clinton or Trump? It's time for
Donald Trump. Donald Trump. Donald Trump.
Of course, retain the White House with the election of Hillary Clinton. America will vote Trump.
We have a projection. It is a big one. It is the state of Florida. 29 electoral votes. They go to Donald Trump.
We have already called Ohio for Donald Trump.
And in modern times, the way
Ohio goes has been the way the country has gone.
Both Clinton and Trump are putting a ton of attention in one particular battleground state, North Carolina.
Donald Trump has won the state of North Carolina.
Donald Trump wins Wisconsin, surpassing the 270 electoral votes.
Huge news. Actually, the AP now projecting that Donald Trump has won the state of Pennsylvania.
There's just no path forward for Hillary Clinton. That's 20 electoral votes from Pennsylvania.
This is CNN breaking news.
The American people have spoken. Donald Trump will be the 45th president of the United States.
It's a presidential election.
Despite getting almost 3 million fewer total votes, Trump won the states he needed to and pulled off an incredible upset. The man almost no one thought would actually run, who no one thought would last the distance, who no one thought would win the nomination, and who almost no one thought would win the election had triumphed. It didn't matter that almost no one thought Trump could do it. He always believed he could. 2.5 months later, on a cold January day, he was inaugurated as the 45th President of the United States.
For the first time, the 45th President of the United States of America, Donald J. Trump.
Throughout his career, his candidacy, and then his presidency, Donald Trump changed the United States in profound ways. He grabbed hold of the fault lines in American society and ripped them wide open. There's just one question left. Why did he run for president? Wouldn't it have been easier just to keep tweeting and doing The Apprentice?
Because he actually cares about America.
The answer is that Trump has always had a burning desire to prove people wrong. Sometimes they're people he loves, like his father, but more often he's spurred on by the thought of shutting up his critics. The mainstream media who never took him seriously, the establishment who considered him unworthy of higher office, and the people who deserted him when he was at rock bottom in the 1990s. I truly believe that Trump decided to run for president after being humiliated by Barack Obama at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. What better way to stick it to all those coastal elites than by taking over the office they cared so much about? And what better way to prove to his father that he was a killer?
I don't think people change very much. You may slow down, but honestly, I don't think people change. I think I'm a very big believer in the fact that when you are a certain way, pretty much that's the way you are. I just don't like wasting time on the past. I don't like to analyze myself because I might not like what I see.
To learn more about the man who defeated Donald Trump in the 2020 election,
who defeated him or cheated?
Joe Biden, just watch this video next.
All right, we're gonna be done for the day.